Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. There was no telling what was going on in the back seat of the car that started down the country highway toward the village of Smorodina, but John fixed his gaze on the road. After all, it had been almost 24 hours without sleep, and he just had to be careful. Mars, Ewo, who's talking? The vadhead Robert with all his Bogader's practically strength. By the time he was 19, he was a 2-meter tall brute pulling a bag of meat, not intending to cede it to a dog. Not because he was sorry. Robert was not the kind of man not to give his hungry little brother a treat. But simply the meat was bought not in a pet store, but in a supermarket for people, and accordingly was generously salted, and even with pepper and other spices. In general, the dog was not allowed such a thing categorically. "Why didn't you put a muzzle on him?" exclaimed the girl sitting next to me, trying to dodge this fiddling in the cramped space of the car interior. He drooled all my pants. "Why didn't you come with us if you don't like dogs?" Robert bellowed. "You snowflake. Who would marry you like that?" And Mars, "You also bite. Give it back. Yuck, yuck." Finally, the bag of meat was picked up and tucked deep into Robert's sweatshirt pocket. "Are you offended?" He turned to Emily's unmoied lips, which were tucked into her phone. But judging by the way she poked, holding back hysterical laughter, not offended at all. "That's what the people said, John. Let's go over it again, point by point." "Okay, we're going on vacation while we clean up." Yeah, I remember." Emily rolled her eyes. "You put the house on the market in the fall. The realtor has already found it, and he says that in this form the house will scare away all the buyers and reduce the value of the object. So instead of having a proper outdoor recuperation, we'll be bouncing around with paint and rakes for 2 whole months." I didn't miss anything. "Oh, come on," pushed her to the side Robert, and winked through the rearview mirror. To the driver he added, "Great. Let's have a good time. I personally have never been to the village in my life. I know it from my grandmother's stories. And I tell you, my friends, that we are in for a great adventure." John yawned widely and, smiling, shook his head. His companions were as usual in their repertoire. And maybe it was the law of attraction of opposites that made them all so good together. They were nothing alike. And then, probably by the will of fate itself, they met one day and, sitting down, intertwined exactly the threads of 3 kolobaks, unraveling everything in one basket. The village house they were traveling to once belonged to John's great-grandfather, then went to his great-grandparents, and from them already to his parents, who, breaking tradition, the land Pashu as the sphere of activity of the entire Melnikov family, became city dwellers. But then one day decided to return to the roots, albeit not in the full sense of the expression. In general, John never seriously considered whether he loved his parents. Of course he did, as any normal child should love his mother and father, if they were not, of course, quite egregious monsters and scoundrels. And John could not call his parents such, in spite of all their faults, the main of which was that at a certain age they decided to do away with bringing him up, living with him, and sent him out of sight. It was all about John being an unplanned child. He found this out at 17, about a month after his high school graduation, when his parents called him in for his first really serious conversation and to voice the decision they had made about his fate. Young John listened to it, and his cheeks flushed with a storm of your most diverse feelings of shame, anger, humiliation, and a sense of the unreal, the realness of what was happening. "I didn't want to give birth," the mother said. "I thought it was a purely female malfunction. I came out and missed my due date," the father added. "Then, of course, we decided that we would raise you, since the higher powers had decided," my mother smiled. And John, at this phrase, almost physically felt that she was lying. "No," he thought later, "you might have loved me." Some parental instincts had come to light, I guess. But first they decided not to give her to the orphanage, because it would not get rid of the problems completely, but would only modify them. You'd have to pay child support, and also would be ashamed. Ashamed in front of people, relatives, colleagues, friends. But nothing of what the young man thought, did not say. He just listened. In general, in his 17 years, John was very quiet, modest, and sullen, according to his peers and his teachers. Yes, he studied diligently, attended sports, even participated in amateur concerts, and also went to camp in the summer. But the boy lacked liveliness, or what? He lacked that direct lightness, which is inherent in all children and adorns the children's period of life, until the time when the guys are quite grown up. Believe me, you have never been a burden to us. The mother continued with feeling and took the father's hand, squeezed it, seeking support, and he nodded, believe me. You couldn't have dreamed of a better son. We didn't plan you, but we love you very much. But now you are a big son, and we are not young people. We want to live for ourselves. We're thinking of moving to the country. Father put in his word. A country house, our family house. We'll rent out the apartment and live there. Fresh air, farm products. That's the way it is. And you, by the way, will have a place to come for summer vacation. Summer vacation? John asked in a colorless voice. Naturally, nodded his father. You're a student. And by the way, I think it makes sense for you to apply to a neighboring city. They have a stronger faculty there. If, of course, you plan to seriously build a career, they live from paycheck to paycheck. Then the neighboring city. Can I get a specific name? And who am I going to live with there? In this, John believed his parents to send him to a different locality. Nothing would be under his hand, but sincerely caring for him. Because in foresight and the ability to make solid decisions, seriously reflecting themselves on studies and work, they were able to always and know that he wasn't a welcome child, whose arrival is a major miracle for parents, who is adored even before he is born. It basically wasn't such a great discovery for him. Because, yes, there had always been some estrangement between him and his parents, but it was strange, frightening, and surprising to John himself. But somehow this conversation didn't hurt him too much. It rather drew a line, clarified what had been generally clear before. But much later, looking back on his childhood, John realized that no, he would not have wished for other parents. Yes, perhaps it was not perfect with these ones, but they still cared for him, did not hurt him, did not reproach him in any way. And as he believed in his heart, they probably loved him with time. It was just that for some reason in their family, it was not customary to talk about such feelings in the open. But then it was too late. As soon as John turned 18, that is, this same year, in July, he left for a neighboring town. He was taken in by Aunt Camille, his father's cousin. She was a kind, cheerful woman. People around them usually say that they have a battery inside, that they are always glowing with positivity. Aunt Camille often came to visit, so John knew her well, and it didn't take long to get used to each other. Camille owned a posh 3-bedroom apartment in a Stalinist-era house. She also owned a small, but quite successful art gallery, inherited from her first and only now deceased husband. At the time of their wedding, by the way, they had a serious age difference of 32 years. But, as Camille herself said, they lived soul to soul, and she never remarried, choosing what to become in this life. By profession, John never doubted that he would be a translator. It just so happened that since childhood, foreign languages were given to him easily. He cracked knowledge as easily as peanuts. Studying in a university, of course, was a task not as simple as school time, but not badly given. In his native city, John, of course, remained all sorts of friends, acquaintances, but with them as quickly lost ties. The thing was that he was always a little aloof from other guys, which was largely explained by the fact that in school he was a typical nerd, and even a little behind the gang. No one let anyone cheat, told everyone that dabble is stupid, and to study hard. Then by the age of 14, John changed the direction of behavior. But as they say, the moment at school was missed. Neighbors continued to consider him a weirdo and a shiv, but in a new place he managed to start all over again. No, John still believed that studies came first. But he also began to realize that life does not consist of it alone. And he had made friends, the best of whom were now traveling with him to the village. Emily was the daughter of Camille's colleague. They are said to be good girls, almost to their 50th birthday. And they carry this characteristic with their heads held high, considering it as an amulet for all occasions of life, and in general a pass to a prosperous destiny. Emily dressed modestly, listened to classical music and maximum of Soviet pop songs, mockingly expressed if she was called to watch a Hollywood blockbuster, despised fast food, but did not attend fitness gyms, believed in one love for life and a bonus when going to the country, firmly stated that no, she would not bake potatoes in a fire with her boyfriends, because that's how carcinogens are formed in them. And yet Camille went with John, and she volunteered herself because she was a loyal friend and wanted to support him morally. And Robert? Oh, Robert wasn't easy. They met when this kid, by the way, 2 years younger than John, he was 17 and Robert was 19, tried to steal his wallet at a bus stop, got caught and gave it back. Asked him to let me go. Yeah, sure, said John threateningly at the time, holding the guy in a grapple. He was taking a self-defense class. So you can hurt anyone else. Are you a criminal? No, I'm a good person, Robert snorted stubbornly and resentfully. All around, people were stroking them, of course. And then suddenly it all came together. The fact that it was November outside, that the thief was already dressed in a common jacket, that he had circles under his eyes. And my stomach suddenly screamed. He let go of the guy and said, "Let's go and talk." The thief, rounding his eyes, but sensing that there would be no retribution right now. Then the floor followed. People at the bus stop gave the young men perplexed looks. John led the hapless thief to a coffee shop, ordered hamburgers, fries, more coffee, cinnamon buns, cheese pillows. "What are you doing?" The thief asked incredulously, but he wasn't drooling on the tray of food. And just now, "What's your name?" "Robert." "John. Let's get acquainted." He held out his hand, and the new acquaintance smiled shyly. "Let's have a snack, and then we'll talk." Coming and going, Robert nodded and unwrapped the hamburger, sinking his teeth into it, greedy and groaning with pleasure. "With double cheese. I love cheese." It turned out that Robert's parents were missing. They didn't work, but they found money for alcohol. Robert wanted to work, tried it, but it didn't work out so well. He got a job at the market, selling shoes. His father stopped by. He wanted money. Robert refused, saying he was sick of his parents' alcoholism, and he wouldn't provide for them. So his father left with a couple boxes of shoes. And that's what Robert got. He was accused of stealing. Naturally, they didn't pay a penny. The owner of the shoe department made Robert work for free for 4 days and said in farewell that he had a lot of acquaintances and would arrange it so that the guy would never be hired anywhere in the city again. "What's your plan?" asked John. "Well, I saw an ad. They're inviting people to work in the region," Robert replied. "They say you can earn 5,000 a day, or even 10. When you turn 18. I went straight away. "No," John said seriously. "It's a bait. At best they pay nothing, but they can also sell you into slavery. Into slavery." Robert laughed. "We are not in the Middle Ages." But then, when John explained to him how it was, he stopped laughing and blushed. "Oh," Robert looked away. "What am I supposed to do? I've only got 9 grades of high school. Where will I go with them?" "Can I go to a vocational school?" said John. "So I see you're confused, kid. Are you going to save me?" Robert grinned bitterly. "No, thanks for feeding me, of course, and for letting me go, but you can't go missing with me. I'm a soul. How can you be so sure? How else could you be?" Robert shrugged. "My father, my uncle, my mother, and the rest of my family drank. My heredity was tainted. A man is the master of his own destiny," John said confidently. "Let's be friends, Robert." For a while, Robert looked suspiciously, as if he might be bitten. He stared at the hand extended to him. Then he took a deep breath and blew his nose, and a firm, masculine handshake took place between two guys so different. That was 4 years ago. And since then, Robert's life had been completely turned around. For one thing, John had the support of Aunt Camille. And though she was a man of no great sting, she dared to risk letting Robert stay with her. He was shocked by such generosity and behaved at first as if he had come to his personal kitten, except that he wasn't hiding behind the couch. It didn't take a psychic to realize Robert had seen little good from those around him before. But despite his environment, in his childhood and adolescence, he had somehow managed to keep, as they say, a pure heart. He didn't spitefully beat himself up, didn't acquire bad habits. He wanted to be a normal person, to make his way to the best. It's just that until now, what's he doing running around in a vicious circle? Exactly. A donkey from ancient Rome who walked tied to a threshing machine, like grain in circles all day long. Robert was helped financially, bought him decent clothes, and even the first smartphone in his life. It was obvious that he was not just fulfilling his duties, but even gladly helped around the house to wash the floor, run to the store, wash, and look all the things. Camille helped with employment. She had a mountain of acquaintances. Robert also went to vocational school. He decided to become an automobile mechanic. During all these years, John only twice came to his parents in the village, visited them for a week in the summer, and also visited them on New Year's Eve and on their birthdays. But he would leave quickly. He just felt that it was not necessary to drag it out with him, because the parents themselves live a wonderful life. And then disaster struck, and they were killed in a car accident. And that's when John really realized how much he loved them, and how hard it was for him to realize that he was not the child they could love with all their hearts. But life went on, and it was decided to take a vacation in the village. The summer was unusually hot and sunny, and then sell the house. The apartment parents John also planned to sell, but later and was going to buy real estate for himself in the city where he lived with his grandfather Camille, where his life now flowed, especially since he had recently received a university diploma, and therefore it was time to go and work. There was already a job waiting for him, as a translator from and into English, in a large trading firm. As for the dog Mars, he was not supposed to appear in a small company at all, but I did, joined just a couple weeks ago. It was a notable doggy in every way. Its breed affiliation, a Robert defined as a groovy brute, Emily as an ugly flea, get away from me, and John as a cocker spaniel. He used to live across the street and was walked by an old lady named Adelaide. Then the old lady died, and her relatives, having hardly returned from the funeral, threw marks out on the stairwell. He, however, not understanding why, with him so longing for the disappeared mistress, howled in the entryway, which annoyed the neighbors. So he was put out on the street, and there he was found by Aunt Camille. In general, she did not keep pets, saying that her heart belonged only to the cat to the other, which lived still at her husband. But past Mars' auntie could not pass, and Castro of Adelaide's heirs, who must have been a fan from the other side of the world, cursed for callousness. Camille brought the spaniel home. The duties of taking him to the vet for preventive care and buying him stuff at the pet store were left to Robert, who yes continued to live in their apartment. The reasoning was that the guy can't go back to his home, to his alcoholic parents. Renting a corner is an extra expense, and at the start of his young life, it's better to let him live where he lived before. But now Robert, by the way, could pay his share of the utility bills. How'd he start making money anyway? He was a generous guy. He always brought a cake for everyone, or someone else, flowers for Camille. Let the live animal hang in the fresh air, Camille said. So Mars went to the village. How beautiful, Robert exclaimed, when the car drove up the hill, from which they had a view of the village of Current. The expanse was indeed picturesque. There was a silvery ribbon of river, a ghostly mist floating over the flooded meadows. The clock showed barely 5 o'clock, and mooing was heard. delirium alive. There was a herd of cows in the village. The houses seemed tiny from here, somehow fabulously antique. Smorodina was not a crowded village, but it was a prosperous one. The locals had jobs in large agricultural holdings, and tourists often came here for ecotourism. Finally, the car reached the village and stopped at the gate of the right house. John got out to open it. "Cool," said Robert, when the whole group was in the yard. "If you're a fan of abandoned places," shook her head and wrinkled her nose Emily. "I'm sorry, John. I don't want to say anything." "Yeah, I know," waved his hand at the guy. "My parents wanted to live in the country, but had no idea how to do it right." The backyard was a sad sight to anyone with any understanding of village life. Shriveled out buildings, a fence overgrown with ivy instead of a vegetable garden, wild grasses. Already at the waist you were waving. There was a barrel lying decayed from time, which once held water. And it wasn't that it had been 6 months since the death of my parents, and there was no one to look after everything. It was just the way it was. And when John arrived, in fact, his parents kept the house more or less in order just to keep it level so it wouldn't fall apart. "I don't understand," Emily said, "why they didn't live in town. Did the mother's asthma get worse with age?" John replied, "The father took a remote job. They said he was drawn to his roots. But I agree with you. It's like living in the village, but we didn't become our own here." "I wish I had a house and a farmstead," Robert said. "I would have chickens in Russia, bought a cow and planted a lot of big and black zucchini." "Black are eggplants," Emily corrected him mockingly. "Let them be eggplants," Robert smiled. "The main thing is that it grows and bears fruit. Otherwise, you should be an agronomist." "Do you want to work with machines yourself?" Emily sighed. "I want to earn a lot of money. I already know how to do it. It's like tuning cars to do. I'll collect cars for rich people and rise on it. And then, and maybe, and in fact, to farmers to fix. Maybe here, or maybe I'll go to Sicily and grow olives there." "You were the only thing missing in Italy." Emily dipped back into her phone and walked through the house, barely looking under her feet. John and Robert started taking things out. Mars, clearly going crazy from the oxygen-rich air and the atmosphere of freedom. The Suburban ran around in circles. "Hey, save me, help me." Suddenly, it sounded from the house, and the boys, throwing everything, rushed into the house. "What happened?" they exclaimed with glee. Emily stood on a stool. Her eyes were round, and there was terror in them. Her lips trembled. Her face was whiter than canvas there. She whispered and jabbed her fingers somewhere on the floor. "A mouse." "There's no mouse." Robert squatted down, looking at the crevices in the floor. "It's under the floor." "The parents didn't seem to use it," John shrugged. "What did they have to store in there?" There was a refrigerator for groceries, drawers under the table for vegetables. "I'm not staying in a house with a mouse," Emily exclaimed hysterically. "How badly does it need you?" Robert grinned. "She's probably more scared of you than you are of her. So let's get our things and have a rest. Personally, I'm tired as a wolf." "Hungry as a wolf. That's the correct way to say it," corrected John's friend. And the boys went back to work. The skewers were cookies and cakes, which Aunt Camille handed out for the road. Boil the kettle and sat at the table. Emily placed an overturned empty box beside it just in case and settled her feet on it. She dreaded the return of the formidable mouse. The dog was not left without food either. Several cans of canned food and a bag of dry food were taken for him. After eating, they began to decide where and who would sleep. Emily, when John conceded the parents' bedroom, he and Robert decided that they would sleep in the second room, which also served as a living room and kitchen. "Wow, that's creepy," said Robert. The boy stood against the wall and looked at the painting. In general, parents did not bother with the furnishings of the house, being satisfied with little. But there were a lot of paintings of reproductions of famous canvases, and all of them in one way or another reflected what John's parents lived. Their passion, which was He suspected even deeper and stronger than the love that had made them marry. They had met through the fact that they had common interests. His father was then a university professor and was known as a ruthless, but also immensely talented history teacher. Her mother was an art historian who had just gotten her degree and was eager to work with something beautiful. By the way, Camille's aunt had told John that if she had not been friends with his mother on the basis of similarity of occupation, because Camille was an art dealer, then probably his parents would not have sent John to her. And so they believed that not only a relative, but also an intelligent person, and therefore can be trusted. John, by the way, did not agree with this very much. He believed that anyone, regardless of what they did in life, could be good or bad. Yeah, I agree. Soso supported his friend John, looking at the painting. I think it was some Scottish painter from the middle of the 18th century. The painting depicted an underwater world, like a lake among swarms of fish and seaweed. Carried along its bottom was Kelly the mythical horse, essentially a demon. Legend said that Kelly sometimes come ashore and wait there for daredevils, who, deciding that the horse is derelict, can become. They try to put a bridle on him or even sit on his back. Legend said that then Keller would throw himself to the lake, and even the most skillful and brave rider couldn't stop him. The demonic horse would dive into the water and carry the man to the very bottom, where he would naturally die. But this was not the end. Legend said that such a poor drowning becomes an eternal servant of the water elves. That's exactly what the hapless horse lover was depicted in the painting. He was pulling his hands up in terror, but he was already united and even greenish in color. Robert, in general, knew what John's parents were doing, but now he suddenly felt it necessary to explain something else to him. And my father decided that it was better for my mother not to work at all, not to waste her health, and she sort of became a housewife. Not really. Anyway, my father gave up teaching just to move to the countryside. He started writing books on history, in magazines, articles, tutors. He also worked remotely. Can you imagine when I said I wanted to study a foreign language? My father thought it meant I'd join the family and help him with his research. And when he found out that I just wanted to work anywhere but in this whole cultural history thing, we had a fight. I see Robert stretched out, looking at the next painting. There's an inquisitor burning a witch at the stake. What kind of research did your father do? Was he looking for pirates' treasure? No, John smiled. He said treasure was a myth, and real historians should dig deeper. Where? I have no idea, John shrugged. We hadn't talked much the last few years. My parents were doing something like studying local history. Well, about how people settled this region, about how the first settlements came to be here. I didn't get into it. And the boys. Emily distracted them. It's the neighbors. What do you want? Robert stretched his neck, looking out of the window into the yard. Let the landlord handle it. Emily nodded at John. A whole miniature delegation of neighbors came. First of all, it was Grandpa James, the old-timer, who in other times would have been appointed headman of the whole current. What rounded his eyes when he heard the price for which John planned to sell the house with the plot. No one would buy it for that kind of money. Is that it, boy? I know your parents, so I'm gonna give you some advice. Grandpa called your fingers. You wouldn't learn. You'd give in neighborly, humanly. My nephew would have bought the house, but for half the price. So John politely said it was impossible because the realtor did a preliminary appraisal. Your realtor's a fool. Spit Grandpa James to the side and left. Kostya at the mercy of unconscious, money-hungry young people. In addition, Nancy's grandmother, about 70 years old, came in. She was strong in the face, however, and offered to buy milk, cottage cheese, and other things from her, as well as eggs, chickens, sauerkraut. Ski, I'll make a daughter, he winked, and the field. Otherwise, it's scary to look at them. So, how am I not skinny? Indignant Emily, who generally accustomed everywhere and everywhere to tell the truth and what she thought. For what, by the way, has repeatedly run into various problems. I'm just watching my figure. I'll come back for milk from the evening milking. John agreed. Thank you very much. Another man, Kevin, came to talk, who worked in agricultural holdings as a tractor driver and offered the same services to neighbors. No, thank you. It's too late for plowing. Next year there will be other owners, John said, but I'll recommend you to them as the best specialist. Then it was Kevin who stepped closer and handed John $5,000. What's this? He didn't understand. Your parents came to me. A down payment for a vegetable garden outbreak. No. Kevin hesitated and glanced at Emily and Robert, as if unsure if it was okay to talk in front of them. But then he went on. He said that John's parents wanted Kevin and his car to go to the woods with them in the fall. Why? Had John stopped understanding anything at all? I don't know. Kevin waved his hands. They said there was some clearing to be done. Maybe building what they wanted in the woods. But why? I know. I just don't have to. So I'm returning it. All right, I'm out of here. Call me if you need anything. After putting the money in his pocket, John called his friends back to the house. He had to get settled in the new place. Plus, they had to check what was wrong with the wiring, because the light bulbs were suspicious, and they had to run to the store to fill the refrigerator. All in all, there was a lot to do. How can you use that? Emily mockingly hid her lips as Robert and John almost taught pleasure. We sampled the milk from the evening milking, unpasteurized. Do you know what you can get from that? I do, Robert replied, wiping his milk mustache with the palm of his hand. Strong immunity. I'm sure you won't. Mars likes it. He nodded at the dog, who was crying from his bowl. At last everyone went to bed. John knew that old houses like this one were capable of making different sounds. The creaking on the knocking of it did not. After all, everything here is made of wood, which is what deteriorates over time. Yes, also, of course, could rustle mice or even rats. But still, in the silence of the night, he was prevented from sleeping by some strange sounds. Robert was lying on the sofa against the wall, and John was on the cot. He turned on his other side and thought about plugging his ears so he could fall asleep. But then he realized that the sounds were, first of all, coming from downstairs, and secondly, they were very suspicious. John licked nervously. If he were a person of a more fragile nervous system and a more vivid imagination, he would have thought it was a ghost moaning softly. Robert, are you asleep? He called softly. I am. The friend answered. Are you asleep? No, you should be. I'm tired. Tomorrow I have to go swimming at the river. Then in the afternoon, if I don't get enough sleep. Robert, what do you want? The friend replied, already visibly irritated. Listen, but be a man. I'm tired. You listen, and I'm listening to you. The boy replied grimly. No, you hear that noise downstairs. For a few minutes the boys were quiet. They were both trying to make sense of the strange sound. You said your parents didn't use the cellar, and it's empty. I think it is. Then what's making the noise? I don't know. Let's check it out. The boys sat on their beds at the same time and stared at each other with round eyes. It was night, but the milky white light of the moon and the silver light of the stars poured into the room, giving the ordinary village atmosphere a certain disturbing mystical tinge. Emily didn't need to be awakened. Robert was already pulling off his jeans. She's a girl. Besides, if there's something really wrong, she won't be much use. What do you mean? What's wrong? John asked. Are there zombies wandering around? His friend said with a serious face. And then he said quietly, Oh, come on, you're watching your horror movies. And then the city of whatever. Horror movies are good for the body. Who said that? British scientists. They show us how to act in dangerous situations, prepare our nervous system for the trials. Do zombies or fighting vampires often help you? Robert did not answer, only smiled enigmatically. Finally, they found a flashlight from the thrown halves and stared at the cellar lid. You're the master. You're the first to go, Robert said, making an inviting gesture with his hand. If you get eaten up in there, don't worry. I'll be there for you, said John, making an inviting gesture with his hand. The lid was locked with a small lock. It had to be picked with some iron. The lid gave in reluctantly with a heavy creak. But Emily in the next room didn't wake up. Only suddenly she wanted to tell a story. She looked away with her eyes. Robert snores like a man, and all of herself such a fragile fairy. John went downstairs and stared suspiciously at the wooden staircase leading down. Then he cautiously began to descend. Finally, his feet touched the floor. What was there shining from above Robert? "Hey, why don't you say something?" John was at a loss for words. The cellar was not so small under the floor, but rather a full basement, and what John was expecting to see here actually. But shelves, racks where the previous owners had stored supplies, maybe a pile of junk. But what he saw coming down hard from the basement, you should see it for yourself. Yeah, Robert came in, walking heavy. He weighed a lot, and finally he was downstairs too. The first thing that caught his eye were the bookcases. Yes, it was a strange place to have chosen for them. But the fact was this: 4 cabinets full of books were discovered in the basement. And by the looks of it, it was an antique. Back in the basement, it was clearly being renovated, and not for $0.03. The floor was concrete here. The walls were leveled and painted. John pointed out the ventilation system to his friend. This place had clearly been done to perfection. There was also a massive table here, piled again with books and maps, also ancient-looking, as well as newer ones that were all scribbled with felt-tip pens and felt-tip pens. In the corner of the basement, Gromov made some equipment, the purpose of which the guys did not even understand, but assumed that it was something digital and complex. It was one of the devices, resembling a metal detector, that emitted the very sound that had initially attracted John's attention. The guy randomly poked at the digital control panel, and the sound disappeared. It must have turned itself on. Maybe that's what happens to complicated machinery, he muttered thoughtfully. But the main thing that caught his eye and made him wonder anxiously about the purpose of this place were 2 things. First, the cage was about 1.5 meters high, 3 meters long, and 2 meters wide. It was made of thick iron bars covered with rust, and there were 3 locks on the door. One of the iron was brand new. The second was silver in color, and the third shone as if it were made of pure gold. And next to the cage were chains, barely as thick as my arm, and several massive steel collars. "John, why? What's that for?" asked Robert, who was no longer smiling or joking. "I don't know." The guy shook his head. He had just picked up a hardcover notebook from the table. It didn't look old. And when he opened it, he saw the dates and realized it was a diary. He also recognized his father's handwriting. "I'm out of here," Robert said, and started climbing up the stairs. "Yes, let's go in the morning." John swallowed the end of the phrase, "what in the morning, we'll figure out. We'll think about what this is all about." Yeah, it was definitely something to think about. "Boys, why so glum?" Emily asked at breakfast. They sat at the table and ate pancakes that Robert had unexpectedly made for everyone. He knew how to cook. Camille had taught him. But because of his constant business, he didn't even do it very often. "Yes," so Robert replied and glanced at his friend. "Looks like John's parents were maniacs. A basement full of maniacal gadgets. Why is Emily frozen?" She couldn't get a bite of her puffed pancake to her mouth. "I don't think they were maniacs," John sighed. "But in all the years I've lived with them, I've never noticed anything like that. And then no, it's just a cage and chains and old books. Where are the pictures of the victims or whatever it is that maniacs usually keep in their basements? Will someone please explain to me what's going on?" The girl exclaimed. "We'd better show you." The guys looked at each other. It was less scary to explore the cellar in the daylight, but still the little group felt uncomfortable and hurried upstairs. "I think this might tell us all about it." Emily nodded at the journal she had found. "Go on, read it. It wasn't like this at all." They planned to spend the day. The sun was shining outside the window. Summer 12 o'clock beckoned with heat, and there was going to be a miracle on the river. How nice and breezy. But all three of them simultaneously felt they would not be able to rest until everything was sorted out. The entries in the diary were sloppy, with some dates missing. In some places over the text with a pen were made some notes with colored pencils. But his father's handwriting was small, ornate, easy to read, and John began to read aloud. Sometimes he was silent, skimming the text to pick out the main points. Sometimes he returned to what he had already read, and he drove his finger over the terms, as if he were checking what was already revealed next. And gradually the picture of what John's parents had been doing lately, and why the contents of the cellar were so strange, began to emerge before the little company. It happened that at some point John's father became interested in the works of a French historian named Charles Dubois, who, however, differed from most of his colleagues in that he belonged to those historians who held alternative views on many events and facts. His writings inspired Father John to look at the history of his native land in a different way, and somehow turning to the history of the earliest period of paganism, he saw in the local tales and legends parallels with the mythology of ancient Scotland, and decided that perhaps the ancient people knew something. It also turned out that the idea of Father John fervently supported his wife, and so the two of them turned to the study of a local legend about a certain water monster Kona, who lived underwater, demanded sacrifices, and also guarded untold treasures. Historian and cultural historian. These are people educated and talented. The last years of their lives were devoted to the fact that they tried to find, learn, and understand how this legend could be connected with reality. It was mentioned in the diary that John's father also consulted a zoologist, that is, a zoologist, in unofficial science, who believed in the existence of mythical creatures not yet known to mankind, including, for example, the same kepi, as well as Sasquatches, Mothman, mermaids, and unicorns. Father John pulled out antique books, maps. He spent all his savings on it. After reading this, John sighed. Now it was clear why there was nothing in their bank accounts after his parents died. Although they had once said that thanks to their frugal network their son would one day inherit a substantial capital. However, it did not seem to matter at all against the background of their sudden and terrible loss. So I understand correctly that your father wanted to find that water horse and the treasure it holds. Is that a cage and chains down there for him? Why are there 3 locks, by the way? What, really? 1 gold one. In Scotland, they believed it was the only way to keep him on land and tame him. There was silence in the house for a few moments. It was only Mars, who suddenly liked the idea of biting the half of it, who spoke, or rather, grumbled quietly. Each of the little company was immersed in his own thoughts. It was probably best to forget all this. The first to break the silence was Emily. You can't bring back the past, and that's all. Well, throw out all the unnecessary and give the books to the library. No, Robert waved his head. You could sell them on the internet. Collectors would snap them up. Maybe even make 1 million. What do you think? He elbowed John in the side. I think I never really knew my parents. He grinned sadly. It turns out they were crazy, and I didn't even notice any signs. Why crazy? Robert objected. You know, don't be like that. It was the parents. Yeah, the picture of the world was different from what they were used to, but you know, at least they treated you well. Mine are kind of serious. They don't believe in mysticism, and this is what it's come to. Booze, huh? Have you tried to cure them? Emily asked me out of the blue. It was as if she hadn't spoken to Robert about it before. Do you think you can take them off like babies and take them to the hospital? Robert snapped at her. All of them. I told them I hated being their son. They don't listen. And you know what? You don't need any advice, okay? I've tried everything, and no. Drinking more, losing their humanity, it's their choice. That's it. Buddy's not simmering down here, so I gave him a pat on the shoulder. We've got it all figured out and more. While he's on a country vacation, we won't broach the subject. Agreed. And finally, everyone finished the basement theme, turning to today. We decided that there was nothing to be lost in its entirety. And so we went to the river. There Robert playfully tried to drag Emily into the water, and she squealed that he was ruining her new blouse. "You're so boring," the boyfriend said, pulling sand out of his head because Emily had tipped it onto the shore. "You'll never find a boyfriend for yourself like that. But tell me who on vacation in the country dresses like for university or office work. All miss, I'm the smartest and most decent." He joked and dodged an empty seashell thrown at him. "I have my swimsuit with me," Emily said, "and sundresses and shorts." "Can't wait to see the prize," whistled Robert. "Just dressed as usual this morning. I'll surprise you tomorrow," laughed Emily. In the evening, so as not to bother cooking, they sent Robert to Grandma Nancy's, from whom they purchased homemade sausages. There was also homemade bread and eggs for breakfast in the morning, and everything else they could eat. Good living. Robert sighed enviously on his return. Granny runs everything. It was already known that Nancy's grandmother had a son and a daughter. The son lives in the city, and the daughter in the village, in her mother's house with her husband and 3 children. And the whole family unanimously obeys Nancy, who, despite her age, does not complain in the least about her health and does not intend to share a grain of power with any of the family. The next morning, while the boys were preparing breakfast, Robert took up baking pancakes again and said that John must learn the recipe because that would surely win his future wife's heart through her stomach one day. Emily undertook to sort through the books from the cellar, and the first few volumes raised new questions. "Who is B.N.?" asked she. "It says here that the books are from the personal library of one B.N.S., but your father's name was Alexander, right? Probably the previous owner, from whom the books were bought," John responded, after breakfast and examined the house and the farmstead. And John made notes in a notebook where and what should be fixed or redone, so that in the end the property would be sold in a decent condition and potential buyers would not have a chance. Picked on everything in the world to drive the price down. The next few days passed surprisingly measured, calm, and even lazy. After the initial anxieties about the cellar find had subsided, the little company discovered that village life was not as easy as it seemed. So was it not easy to get used to the quiet? No, naturally the village was full of noises of its own, but none of it compared to the noises of the city. And at night you could listen to crickets and nightingales. Well, at any rate, Robert said it was the nightingales that were singing, and it had to be the nightingales, and he didn't know how to identify any other songbirds, and Emily timidly asked him to try a little. When Robert once again brought a jar of warm steaming milk from Nancy's grandmother, "Aren't you afraid?" The boy grinned, filling the mug. Emily waved her head and grabbed the mug with both hands and even managed to drink, stood for a minute with her eyes crinkling, then cupped her lips and smiled. "Delicious," she said, and John had to put Mars on a leash because the dog was always trying to run off somewhere out into the vast countryside. Mars, of course, the restriction of his rights, was not happy and expressed this discontent with complaints and sounds. One day John, once again coming to Nancy's grandmother for provisions, became an accidental witness of her conversation with a neighbor. Who can be trusted? "Oh, what's going on?" Nancy was emotionally indignant. "You don't say," the neighbor spluttered. "Charles spent his whole life collecting these books. The thieves had no heart at all." John in earshot, hearing that first and last name. Something about them, coupled with the mention of books, seemed vaguely familiar to him. "Thieves. Is there crime here?" he asked. "Of course there is," she sighed. "We don't live on Mars after all. We seem to be peaceful, but things happen. Charles had his books stolen almost a year ago. We don't know who did it. Charles was our teacher. He taught math, history too," Nancy explained. "He's retired now. He's an avid collector of old books, you know. And someone had the nerve to insult an old man. It's just awful," John muttered, desperately hoping his cheeks and ears weren't flaming scarlet, because he seemed to know exactly who had stolen Charles's property. He waited for Nancy to hand him the groceries he needed. Then he paid her off and almost ran. The milk, which he was afraid of spilling, prevented him from really running. He ran towards his house. "My parents stole the books," blurted out John, barely getting out into the hay, and told his friends everything. "What are we going to do?" asked Robert. "Should we return the books?" Emily said sternly. "It's an obvious thing to do," John thought. "But how to do it?" Robert said simply. "Drop it off at night along with a note in which to write a sincere apology. They might find us by our fingerprints, though. No one's gonna come looking for us." "Why would the old man do that?" said Emily. "Because the books were stolen," said Robert. "So he said that we returned them." Confused in the flow of thoughts of the interlocutor Emily, and still emotionally, said Robert, "I think we'd better just go to him and personally hand over the books," suggested John. And everyone looked at him as if he had no mind to explain the situation as it is. "After all, I'm not personally responsible for my parents' actions, and you are not involved at all. Just my friends." "Oh, okay. Perhaps this is really the most reasonable way out," agreed after some thought Emily. "I'm in." Robert winked. "But if anything, you mean that I have a passport and I can run to Mexico." "Why Mexico?" Emily frowned. "Because they don't seem to extradite criminals from there," replied Robert with the most serious look. "What makes you think that?" The girl raised an eyebrow. "I heard it in some action movies." "You watch too much nonsense." "To the circus on La Emily. I don't even read fiction." "Why should I read fiction when I can read self-development?" "Let's go today," John interjected. "I think the sooner we get this thing over with, the better." And everyone agreed. John went to Grandma Paula's house again, under the pretext that he wanted to learn something important from the antiquities collector, because his parents, as it turned out, also valued rare books. Asked Charles' address. It turned out that he does not live in W Current, but in a neighboring village, which also bore the rather remarkable name Central Badgers, where badgers all sorts of other side badgers, for example. Curious? Robert asked, but no one gave him an answer. The whole group, including Mars, went to the Central Badgers. The thing was that the dog, it turned out, hated not only to sit on a leash, but also to be alone. When they left for the last time, went for a swim at the river, then on their return received an angry lecture from the neighbors that their beast was howling so passionately, how pitiful it was. But it also interfered with the afternoon sleep of old people and children. "Good afternoon," said John cheerfully, as the gate opened and the face of an old man with a white, neat Spanish beard and penetrating blue eyes with tight eyebrows appeared behind it. "We'd like to see Charles," corrected him. "For what, may I ask? Do you want tutoring before you go to college?" "No, I'm already in my senior year," smiled John. She nodded at Emily too. "And he's going to live with a high school diploma," he finished about Robert. "But that doesn't mean I'm worse or stupider." Whether in jest or for real, the latter stood up for his human value. "You see, I'm Melnikov's son. I've heard about this misfortune," nodded Charles. "I'm sorry. You see, it's hard to explain," but John drew more air into his chest, gathering his courage. "I've come to return your books. They were stolen from your library." Charles stiffened, frozen, as if not believing the reality of the young man's words. Then his gaze changed from questioningly wary to astonished, and finally it warmed. "Come in, of course." Charles from the Coup de Grace and the little company entered the courtyard. "Don't be alarmed," Charles said, when a huge, nearly bear-sized dog's face emerged from the booth, and then an equally impressive-sized dog body appeared. "That's me. She's completely harmless. It's just that she seems to be interested in yours." "What is the name of the marvelous creature?" Charles asked, leaning toward Mars and stroking his head boldly. After calling the spaniel's name, John watched with interest as Mars squealed and tore himself from the leash, clearly eager to meet the selfies, which also commanded a tail. "You keep him out." Charles wagged his finger at the guests. She's going through, pardon the physiological details, she's going through a phase where she's about to become a mother, you see. Are you planning on going again, daughter? Perhaps someone you know would like to have one. No, John said, and for some reason he blushed. I don't want to be the owner of a merry bunch either. Charles smiled. So let us all, not excluding Mars, come into the house. Alive, as you can see, alone, said Charles as they entered the house. Inside it was simple, but very clean and even cozy. There were flowers in pots on the windows and a real samovar. I was just about to have tea, Charles said. So, young people, please come to the table. And we didn't come empty-handed. Go ahead, Robert. Let's have tea with this, shall we? He said, handing Charles a box of chocolates. They chose the most expensive and ornate of all those sold in the village store. At first, they just drank a cup of tea, sampled the candy, and talked about village life. Then, without haste, and with evident pleasure, Charles examined all the books that had been returned to him. He stroked the spines and pages, shook his head, and chuckled softly. Thank you very much. You are a nice young man. I'm really sorry I didn't say more, Charles exclaimed. It's rather my own fault. You see, your father came to see me once. He was looking for help in a delicate matter. And I suppose you already know what it is, since you found out about the missing books. Yes, John nodded. My parents searched. They believed in all those myths. I didn't believe his suggestion that we find a campsite. Charles smiled sadly. And I have to admit, I'm still ashamed of my callousness. I should have realized how important it was for him to have access to those books as a historian, even if I didn't believe it. I literally had a fight with your father. And for that, I truly apologize from the bottom of my heart. I called him a gullible fool and told him his scheme was a disgrace to the historical profession. How wrong I was. You say you were wrong. But why? Asked Emily. Did you now believe W? No, dear girl, smiled Charles. But what should I have lent my books? Was your father a good man? John. He would have returned them. As it was, I pushed him into the crime myself. You see, I didn't want to share the books because, you see, it hurt my professional pride, and he had to go along with it. When I went to town, I have a son living there. I went to visit. You asked me if I believed in Kindle. Charles poured everyone another cup of tea from the samovar. Sadly, no. Belief in such miracles, you may agree, could make everyday life a little brighter. But I believe that almost every legend has some truth in it, in the sense that stories and legends and many fairy tales are almost always rooted in something real, even if they are presented to people in a highly altered, distorted form. He and Charles talked a little more about everything, and then they all went back. Current. At the village rest. A few more days and youth flew by. Behind the fence stood Grandpa James and waved, attracting the attention of those who went out into the yard. The old man looked worried. Have you seen our tractor driver? No, he hasn't, Robert answered. What happened? He asked. He's missing. What do you mean, missing? Asked Emily. In her hands the girl was holding a broom, in which courageously, though from the last nervous strength, she was collecting cobwebs from under the windows of the house. How should I know? James waved his hands. He had to go to work today, you know. And just like yesterday, he drove his tractor into the woods. So he disappeared on the way. He drove off, and he must have swerved. How's that? Robert was surprised. If the tractor goes anywhere, it won't be noticeable. It would leave a trail like an elephant. Kevin, I will not take the wheelchair through the field. He's a skillful fellow, Grandpa James declared with a thumbs up. How do I know? How did it happen? Maybe Leshy taught him how to cover his tracks and confuse them. Don't listen to him, said a woman in her 40s who came to the fence. We think Kevin left his tractor somewhere in the woods. We just haven't gotten around to it yet. He just said he had some important business in the woods, so he probably has nowhere else to be. We figure if we can't find him by tonight, we'll call a rescue team. Rescue squad it is. And since he went missing last night, "It's time to call it in," Emily said. "I don't know what could have happened to him in the woods, guys." She turned to her neighbors in the village rest. "Let's help." "Well, we can," nodded John. But however, he did not consider it a good idea. First of all, because he was seriously afraid that they might get lost. And then it would often be 4 people who would have to be rescued from the forest captivity. Unless, of course, they're used to whining about anything. It's a city snowflake. Emily will not attract the wolves that will eat it. And secondly, although he realized that it is extremely cynical, but John did not understand why. In fact, they should look for the missing tractor driver. In fact, a stranger to them, especially since there was someone else to do it. The villagers were gathering, and the rescuers were to join soon. But still, John backed Emily and Robert in agreement. "Let's give Mars some of this man's stuff to sniff and he'll find it," suggested Robert. "Mars doesn't look like a former search dog," objected John. "He's more likely to be wooden or a former search dog without special training. Dogs can't do that." "Too bad," said Robert disappointedly. "Then I'll just now pack a backpack quickly and move out for." We left literally half an hour later. Grandpa James said that the villagers had decided to enter the forest from the outskirts of Rodinka, and so the small company, reasoning that there were enough people in that direction without them, decided to move into the forest from the river. The sun was high in the sky, and the friends figured that they could easily do, so to speak, their duty to search for the missing neighbor in a couple of hours, and then return home. They would have lunch and go about their business. "It's beautiful," Robert exclaimed for the umpteenth time. I was smart to dress like that. It was hard not to agree with him. He had bought a light, but covering the maximum of the body, clothes, and even the cap had a special net to protect his head and neck from insects. John dressed more lightly and was now suffering from bites. And Emily in general went in shorts, and now every minute complained about the universal injustice. "You could have come back. Stay home at all." "No," stubbornly declared the girl, and once again with a quiet tone slapped himself on the leg, knocking down a mosquito. "I have a cream, refreshing for the skin. I'll put it on later. It won't help," Robert said in a collector's tone. "I told you to take mine. It's insect repellent. It stinks. Who's going to smell you in the woods?" And after another half an hour, when my feet began to itch unbearably, Emily finally agreed to use a special remedy. The friends walked through the forest, loudly shouting the name of the missing tractor driver. At first, they thought they heard the voices of other seekers, but then they determined that they had mistaken their own egos for them. The friends hoped not to stray too far from the edge of the forest. "Who knows 10 signs that you're lost?" Robert asked after a while. "I don't know. What are they?" asked John, stopping and slumping against a tree. He pulled a bottle of water out of his backpack and gulped greedily. "They must exist. But even without them, it's clear we're lost." Robert began. "Yes, sorry they are. That was funny." "Yes, it was." Emily frowned and looked around anxiously. "We couldn't have gotten lost." "Why not?" John asked. "Because we always stayed near the edge of the forest, and even the field was visible through the trees." The girl answered without much confidence. "And now it's all forest," Robert sighed. "And this is the 4th time we've come back to this point with mushrooms. So there are exactly 2 facts. We are lost. We are walking in circles." For a few minutes, everyone was silent. "But wait." John grabbed Emily by the arm. "Where are you going?" Strictly he asked the girl, who was breathing strangely, very hard and often, and her eyes were darting from side to side. "Let me go. I can't stay here. I can't." "She's panicking," Robert said knowingly. "Slap her or pinch her harder, and she'll come to her senses," ignoring such harsh advice. John just gently shook Emily by the shoulders and ordered her to look him in the eye. "We're going to get out of here. Calm down. It's not winter, and that means we're not freezing. We have water and food with us. We have half a bottle of water left on us at most. And Mars needs to be fed," Robert grumbled. But John gave him a scary look and went on. There's a bunch more villagers walking through the woods. Soon the rescuers will be here, so everything will be all right. Do you understand me? Can you hear me?" "Yes," answered Emily, who was finally able to calm down a little. Meanwhile, the sun was beginning to sink behind the treetops. Robert, praising himself for his foresight, fed Mars a couple of guests, grabbed some dry dog food, and poured the rest of his water into a bowl. Then he suggested we take a break. One could look at it all positively. With an uncertain smile, tried to cheer up the girl John. "We're in for a real adventure. I don't suppose that's ever happened to you before, has it?" "Fortunately, I had a normal life before." Emily, on the other hand, had her nose perched on the trunk of a fallen tree. "What are we gonna do? Sleep on the bare ground?" "There's plenty of conifers," John explained. "If you don't break your legs, you can make a pretty good bed. But summer ones are warm and we'll make a fire," Robert said enthusiastically. "We'll tell scary stories." "Oh, Dizzy is silent and please." "I couldn't stand it," I shouted. And then Emily appeared. John shook his head reproachfully and asked Robert to be tactful. The man spread his hands but was quickly distracted. There were pressing matters to attend to. A fire had to be built, and the aforementioned Labnik had to be brought in. Soon it became completely dark, and everyone moved closer to the fire. The warm amber scarlet light was soothing and made them feel safe. "Are there any wolves around here?" Emily asked. "No, it's been over 70 years since they were exterminated," said John. "Sorry, I should have insisted we didn't go anywhere. It's not a vacation in the countryside. It's a bit of a mess." "It's all right. We'll get over it," Robert smiled. Soon everyone, and even Bodrov. It seemed that 24 o'clock in a day Mars began to fall asleep, but barely rested on his paws, barely closed his eyes and relaxed. All three of them caught a glimpse of sounds coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Mars woke up too, raised his ears wary. "What is it?" Emily asked. And then suddenly she was beside Robert, as if his closer presence could protect her. "It sounded like banging on a rock," John suggested cautiously. He swiveled his head, but he couldn't figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. "Maybe a moose sharpening its horns," Robert said. What did he add in response to his friend's stares? "Well, or a lynx. The claws need to be looked at." John rose resolutely from his seat and picked up his lantern and picked up his backpack from the ground, for it held everything he had taken on this unexpectedly long hike, and he didn't know what of it might end up being useful. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily ventured, looking anxiously at the fire. "Unless we take a torch with us." "I don't know how to make a torch," said John. "We have flashlights. The three of us. It's just a forest that doesn't even have wolves in it. We should check to see if there's a man in trouble trying to attract attention. Or is the woodsman luring us into the thicket to kill us in the swamp?" Robert added, but seeing how the faces of John's friends had changed, she turned reproachful and at Emily's commanded, hastily apologized. Moving through the night forest, when all the lighting was weak, and not at all a tourist flashlight, yes, the rays of the moon checking through the thick branches, it was not an easy task. But somehow we didn't break our legs, we didn't collapse in hawthorn bushes, and only once Robert with curses flew into a thicket of nettles. And then all of a suddenly, everyone was out in the clearing. It seemed that some fairy giant had simply sickled giants with whom Thoth had cut out a part of the forest, leaving an immaculately round ground on which to make a mountain of green stones, but not because they were some rare rock, but because they were all overgrown with moss. Cautiously warned Robert, almost flapping underfoot in places. "That means we came into the swamp from this side of the forest. But here it's slowly beginning, I guess, and somewhere farther away it's a real swamp. We're moving this way, you know. This part of the clearing is dry. That's why the rocks are standing. They're underground." The sound stopped, John said, waving the flashlight from side to side. "Hey, is anybody alive? And do you imagine you'll get an answer?" "And negative," Robert joked grimly. That's a weird question. Oh, shut up. Almost crying, Emily asked. I'll never go outdoors again in my life. I hate the forest. These prickles, insects, twigs. I want to go to the city, quietly whispered to his friends John. Do you hear that? They listened and indeed caught some sound, as if there was a rustling and a Smolensk mouse somewhere nearby. There are people here. The whole trio jumped when they heard a human voice. It sounded strange. The story seemed to come from under the ground. Where are you? Asked John, moving cautiously forward. And now, shining a flashlight under his feet, a voice reported from below. Said, I think I broke my leg. Who are you? Asked John. Kevin, replied the voice. And you are the townspeople? Yes, they are. We are Zator. Robert echoed and rushed forward. In his panic, he inadvertently grabbed the flashlight he had taken from Emily. The tech was running, and the guy was trying to fix it somehow. Left unlit, the girl fearfully took a chance and skipped following. So I think I found it, reported John, stopping at the place where the rocks began. From the side, they looked like something familiar. And after a moment, John realized that it was like Stonehenge, except that the stones were smaller and more frequently spaced, so that there was little space between them. John moved very carefully, but his foot almost slipped into the black hole. There were also stones lying on the ground at this spot, but one flat one appeared to have been pushed to the side. Nearby lay the thing that had made it possible, a huge metal bar barely an arm's length thick. The flashlight beam slid down and snatched up a familiar face that reflected a renamed palette of emotions. It was indeed Kevin. It turned out that he had lowered himself down on a rope, but had tied it around one of the rocks insufficiently securely, as a result of which it had torn under his weight, and Kevin had collapsed down with an injured leg and no way to get out. The rope and his backpack were found nearby. But why did you come up here in the first place? Emily wondered. The whole village is looking for you. Do you know? It's a long story, replied the tractor driver. It seems that we have enough time to listen to it, said John, figuring out how to get the grief of speleologists outside. There was nothing suitable in the friends' backpacks, as it turned out. Kevin had another rope in his backpack, apparently a spare, but it seemed very thin and unreliable. But after thinking about it, John decided that if he screwed it in half, it might hold. And while he was doing that, Kevin spoke. He said he was just looking for something. Looking for what? Asked Emily, who could have sworn that Kevin wasn't telling the truth. Guys, it sounds like he was looking for the same thing your parents were looking for, Robert said. Yeah, I know. He waved his hand as two pairs of eyes turned to him. It wasn't good to poke around in other people's things, but he held up a hand that held a book similar to the ones John's parents kept in the basement, and tucked between the pages of the book was an antique map. It was unique to the backpack, Robert said. Did you guys go a little crazy too? Were you looking for a water horse? Robert turned to Kevin. No, he answered with a sigh. I was looking for gold. I've got a loan in the bank. My son's wife's nagging me. And by the way, I didn't steal those books. I just borrowed them. That is, if you follow the letter of the law, you took without asking, and in fact, still stole, summarized Emily. I'm sorry, Kevin said pitifully. When all this happened to my parents, I came to the wake, and I took it. Yes, I know, as a bastard did. But you're not gonna leave me here for that, are you? Get me out of here. Please, save me. Of course we won't leave you, John replied, and threw down a rope. Hold on tight there. Now we will lift a little, pull all three of us, and then grab my hand. It was clear here, Kevin, everything was clear. And soon all four of us would pull the load together. But he was pulled out. The tractor driver stretched out on the ground, and for a couple of minutes just tried to catch his breath. Then he got to his feet and immediately ducked his foot. It was okay to step on, but it hurt. So you were looking for gold. What made you think that one? Robert asked. Sighing, Robert looked around at his friends and finally spoke. It turned out that John's father hadn't just asked him for help, He wanted to move these very stones in the forest, so he shared the content of the legends. Kevin, however, did not believe in the water horse, but decided that this fairy tale could be really connected with buried gold, and the water horse was invented by the people to scare away the hunters for riches. So Kevin decided that we can't wait any longer. We have to get the gold ourselves. Until the townspeople also studied the books and went to look for it. How? Is there anything down there? Asked John. No, Kevin shook his head. Just some old hardware, right? Robert rushed to the rocks, lay down on his belly, and shone his flashlight inside. The cavity, or rather, the hole, hidden for years under the stone, was small and perfectly visible. Earthen floors, walls through which tree roots had worked, some old iron on the floor and clay shards. Maybe, Robert suggested, there was some kind of burial ground or temple of antiquity here. I don't know. We'll figure it out later, John said. We have to get out of here on our own, he added. Gloomy, because you can't get cell phone reception in a place like this. Which way to go? Robert asked. That way, John answered confidently. That's where we came from. Yes, it's almost light. In fact, I think we'll be out of the forest soon. But in practice, it turned out that the forest seemed to be only further away, where the rescuers were grumbling. Emily, I'm tired. Only one Mars, it seems, felt excellent and cheerfully settled down next to me. And then the dog at some point became alert and pulled everyone to the side. John looked where the animal was leading and almost shouted with joy. There was a gap between the trees ahead, and that could only mean that they were finally out of the forest. Indeed, the forest soon turned gray, and the little company found themselves in a meadow that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were still some trees, but it looked more like a grove than a forest. But the main thing that caught the eye was the lake, shining with ghostly sparks in the light of the moon and the sky that had barely begun to lighten. Are there any lakes near Current? Robert asked. There are, Kevin replied. The witches call them lakes. The fish bite well here. Why do witches call me? Robert asked. That's what they say. The tractor driver lowered his voice. The cursed ones only come here at daylight. What kind of nonsense is that? Exclaimed Emily, who had barely left the woods. The common ones are back. Her skepticism and intolerance if anyone was superstitious. You'll tell me it's a creature that lives here. What's his name? Emily took a few steps ahead of the men and stood in front of them with her hands at her sides. All right. Listen to me carefully, everyone. As soon as we get out of here, I'm going straight home. I've had enough adventures. Right. The wind's blowing. Too bad about the mice. A bird called out in a long, high-pitched squawk. As Robert Vodianova said, the horse's name is Kelly, and he's the one right behind you right now. Emily opened her mouth to answer Kolk, and to whip that insufferably moo-type seagull who had recently caused in her such a storm of contradictory feelings. But she didn't make a sound because right now a sound came from behind her back. It was a heavy, thick, voluminous, horse-shaped horse. Emily turned very slowly toward the lake. There, on its opposite side, a black head had emerged from the bushes. A thick, wet mane fanned her and the horse's neck. Twigs and something green were tangled in the beer. It seemed that the eyes, black as agates, barely distinguishable on the raven color of the creature, looked piercingly into the very souls of the people gathered on the shore. For a few moments that seemed like an eternity, the creature just stared at the people. And then Mars was angry with a piercing bark. It was as if the genetic memory of the ancestors had suddenly awakened in the small apiary. After all, representatives of this breed were originally bred as hunting dogs. He fell down on his belly button and, sliding, grumbling at all odds, moved forward. Several ducks erupted from the nearest bushes, clearly frightened of such a formidable enemy, a mysterious creature. The black horse froze. He scrutinized the approaching dog, who, however, did not yet venture directly into the water. The canal creature again lingered loudly, shrilly, menacingly, and darted forward with powerful legs, knocking the water into the lake, raising a cloud of spray. The people on Bereshko screamed as if on cue and scurried away. Marks, apparently realizing that he had overdone the grumbling, also scurried away. "Tell P," shouted Robert. "Run for your lives." The tractor driver was running fast, despite his sore leg, and was already hiding behind the trees. John also rushed, but behind. Emily cried out. He turned around. The girl tripped and fell, and the water horse was already looming over her. Streams of water flowed from his magnificent watery hide, mane, and tail. The rising sun was reflected in the water, giving the illusion that the horse was shining, as if studded with diamond dust. "Stop," John exclaimed. "Stand still. Who did I tell you to stand still?" He angrily called out to the men before they could get lost in the forest again. "Emily." He approached the girl, who, lying on the grass, was curled up in a ball. The man covered her head, and hard on the sobs of the oxen. "It's just a horse, Emily." The animal meanwhile finally got out of the lake, which must have been because it was a hot summer and the water level had dropped. It reached his neck as the horse crossed it. The horse looked at the men with curiosity. He was not at all hostile and looked rather very interested. "Why, that's it. That's not our animal," Kevin, who had returned, exclaimed. "Oh, I remember. It's always dying. Servant, where all the cattle graze, clean and walk around in the middle of nowhere. Don't be afraid." The tractor driver turned to Emily, who finally got to her feet with John's support. Wet with dew, shivering, and still talking through his nose. "He's docile, but he can bite." "Don't be impatient," said Robert, who had also returned, and there was disappointment in the guy's voice. "Okay, so everything's fine. And he's so handsome. I wish I had a horse. I'd drive it all over the world." That's what John said. "Let's go back, shall we?" "But where to go? You're not lost now." Kevin waved his hand. "Here it is. We'll go around the lake here, and then we'll come out of the mountains like currents. Let's go, shall we?" The return of the lost tractor driver was greeted with great enthusiasm by the villagers. They had already had time and were about to call rescuers when they realized that they could not find the tractor driver themselves. "It's all right." Kevin fought off the neighbors' questions. "I got a little confused. Well, I'd had a few drinks, so he decided to take a ride on the tractor. Yeah, I remember where it's parked. What's all the noise? It's not going anywhere. Of course, nobody's driving it away. Who would steal it near the forest? Hares. It's all right, but I'm going to see a doctor. I hurt my leg." Robert, John, and Emily looked at each other. It was clear that Kevin did not intend to share the story with anyone, and the hole he had found in the woods was under rocks. But so far it was unclear to them why he had kept quiet about it, unless it was because he was embarrassed that they would talk about him, an unsuccessful treasure hunter who believed in gray tales. Finally, everyone returned home and slept the rest of the day because they were very tired. The friends woke up only to have a couple of snacks and, of course, to feed Mars. The next day, a realtor from the city unexpectedly came to the village. A real estate agency employee came to say that in principle, a house can be very much a not to repair because it has already found a buyer who, in fact, needs only a plot of land, and he would demolish the wooden house and build a brick one instead. John understood that in principle it was a normal business-like offer and that he would have less worries. But at the same time, it gave him an unpleasant feeling in his heart. After all, it turned out that the farewell to the home of his parents, the home of grandparents, distant ancestors, it became closer and took on more real and harsh features. But the boy answered in agreement. "I'm not a gardener myself anyway. Yes, and go far away, if just for a weekend vacation." He explained his decision to his friends. "So I'm selling unequivocally." "And what to do with all this?" asked Emily. "You can't give the basement as a package." "Of course not," agreed John. A couple of days later, he visited Kevin, who announced that his leg was almost completely fine. It was just a little sprain. Kevin agreed to help clear out the basement and soon showed up with all the necessary tools. The same cage needed to be sawed down so that it could be taken to the junkyard normally later. Castle's silver and gold John decided to keep as a memory of his parents. He also decided to keep his father's diary and some books from their personal library. The rest of the volumes were photographed by friends and put on the internet for sale, but a few more books he decided to donate to the local village library. "What are these?" Robert asked. He had seen John wrap a few particularly ancient books in gift paper and tie them nicely with ribbon. He had bought both the day before at the local store. "I think we should do some justice and pay one person a visit after all." John smiled. "By the way, we saw Mars. I asked him to eat, but he wouldn't come." "He seems to be running around somewhere," Robert said. "It's not all the time for him to sit on a leash, right?" Soon we went to the neighboring village to see Charles. Not empty-handed again. This time we took a cake, which, by the way, in order not to spoil while walking in the hot weather, we put a cooler in the bag. Charles, fortunately, happened to be at home. He was surprised by the guests, but surprised pleasantly, and immediately went to put the samovar on for a tea party. "Mars," John marveled when suddenly the poster's face appeared from the box, followed by the spaniel. "I was just about to take him to you," said Charles. "He ran straight to my girl. I guess they're in love. But if they do breed, he'll be in good hands. Don't worry, I'll take full charge." Finally, we sat down at the table. Charles praised the cake and opened the present with a sigh of sympathy. "You know, after your father came to see me, I went back to that conversation more than once," he said thoughtfully. "And after your parents' accident. Anyway, I decided to do some serious research on the subject. Just a moment." With a warning thumbs up, the old man got up from the table and went into the next room, where something was rustling about. "Here," he said, when he returned and gently set down on the table a book from his own collection. It looked as if it might crumble at the slightest touch, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. "See?" Charles asked. Robert, John, and Emily leaned toward the page. They couldn't make sense of it. "It looks like some kind of puzzle," Robert suggested. "And you?" Smart glared at him from behind the glass of his glasses. "Charles, would you like to go to history school?" "No, thanks for that," Robert smiled. "There are only two things I like about history: adventure books and movies like that. So, have another look here. It's really interesting," Charles said to his guests. And finally, he explained himself. He also opened one of the books that John had given him and said that similar information in it directly confirmed the truth of some facts in the book that Charles himself had owned, and the accuracy of the information he had doubted until today. It turned out that the page really depicts a puzzle, and the book itself was written in the middle of the 19th century and spoke in it just about those local legends with kipi and gold. However, this scientific work was not widely disseminated for the reason that its author rejected the idea that somewhere in this area could be buried untold treasures. He believed that it was some ancient pagan monument dedicated to some pagan deity. He believed that what could be discovered were antiquities, priceless objects that belonged in museums, but not trivial piles of gold coins. It is believed that it could have been an underground temple and that it could have had hiding places, which were, literally not far from the mole, possibly right in our very forest. And theoretically, having analyzed this puzzle, I had already established the approximate coordinates of the hiding place. And in that book you gave me, it was such a wonderful coincidence. There was a confirmation of that, too. "Actually," said John, looking on, "with Robert and Emily, we seem to know what you're talking about. We seem to have found one such hiding place," Robert added emotionally, and he swung his hand so hard that he almost knocked the cup to the floor. "Are you serious?" Charles looked at them incredulously. The little group had to tell the whole truth about their night adventure. Charles listened to them, nodding attentively and stroking his beard. And at the part where they met, Seder laughed heartily. "Well, young men," he shook his head, "I think I need to see it all with my own eyes." "And right away." "No," Emily protested. We'll get lost again, won't we? Absolutely not, Charles smiled. I know these woods inside and out. I grew up here, and I know the place you told me about too. We used to play there often as kids, but who would have thought that underneath one of those rocks could be such a secret? It turns out my hunch was right. Let's go. Let's find out tonight. Let's not take Mars with us anymore, said Robert. He might get off his leash this time and get lost in the woods. Can we leave your dog here? Charles suggested. They are with Fifa and get along well. Trusting Charles not to get lost and to return even before the sun sets, you set off. Emily had thoughtfully and generously poured bug spray on herself this time. The clearing with the stones seemed less mystical in the daylight, and the rocks themselves seemed smaller. Be careful, please, John asked. He noticed the vigor with which Charles intended to climb down. Oh, young man, when I was your age, I spent all my free time hiking. And such experience, you know, is not forgotten, Charles answered cheerfully. And then, much to the surprise of those present, he skillfully fixed the rope on the trunk of the nearest stone circle. The tree threw it down, then sent the bag with some intercepting tools down there, and finally climbed down himself. For a while there was only some rustling from below. This is incredible, Charles exclaimed. You've got to see it. I'm not going down, Emily said firmly. And then, if the three of you are down there, it'll get stuck, and someone will have to go and get help. John and Robert called her a coward. Hay waved goodbye, and with an enthusiastic anticipation that Charles had discovered something extraordinary, they went down. And they were not mistaken. Charles had removed some of the earth from one of the walls of the pit, and behind it was revealed something near a door. It had been built, of course, a long time ago. It was made of intricately woven wood and metal parts, and naturally, over time, the former had molded out of the mold altogether, and the latter had practically crumbled at the slightest touch. So the door, when Charles pushed it forward, didn't just fall off, but rather collapsed. Behind the door revealed a low one. It had to be bent hard. The corridor looks like it turns off from the steps in about 20 paces to somewhere sideways. Aren't we going to fall in here? John asked apprehensively. It shouldn't, Charles replied. You see, you can see some rocks in the ground here. It looks as if the slabs were used to reinforce the corridor. They were built to last. Where are we going? The light of the flashlight was lost somewhere far ahead. We passed one turn, then another. John estimated that, judging by the length of the corridor, this strange underground building went far beyond the glade. The bronze and ceiling and tree roots spoke of it in places. It smelled of dampness, of earth, and the farther they traveled, the more uncomfortable John felt. The thought that there might be a cave-in still lingered in his mind. Suddenly, a new turn ended in a wide passage into what could be called an entire underground hall. It was at least a meter wide, and about the same length. The ceiling here was supported by roughly scribed stone columns. John and Robert couldn't help but sigh in admiration when they saw that there were still piles of pottery, both unpainted and multicolored. There were piles of them, some whole, others damaged. There were also some ancient metal items stacked here, and among them glittered a few silver coins. In the center of the room stood a stone sculpture, and at once one could realize that it was not made of ordinary stone, but of something that the guys by their not the most complete knowledge defined as black marble. This statue depicted a horse standing up on its hind legs, and how marvelously it was done. Even in the meager light of the flashlights, one could distinguish the waves, mane, and tail, the emotional expression of the muzzle. And the most amazing thing about this sculpture was that in addition to its hind legs, the horse also had a mermaid tail, and on its flanks and chest, one could see bone carvings that imitated scales. Charles confusedly and enthusiastically explained that this was direct evidence that similar myths and legends could be found in different parts of the world. And so it turned out that in these parts of the world they had believed long ago in the same kind of water horses that were mentioned in the fairy tales of Scotland. Well, young people, said Charles with a sigh. Congratulations. You and I are now discoverers of something incredible. What about that mountain of shards? Did you find it? Emily asked skeptically and even snidely when they got to the top. You won't believe it when you see it, Robert said, handing Emily a smartphone that captured the underground finds. Charles insisted that when they returned to the village, his companion should not say a word about anything to anyone. He was seriously concerned that a crowd of curious, if not eager, antiquity seekers might interfere with the normal exploration of the site, as well as with the preservation of all the finds. And only later, when real historians and archaeologists came to Smorodina, everything and everyone became known to everyone. Well, why didn't you say anything? Kevin was indignantly offended. You could have told me. It's thanks to me. In fact, all this good stuff was found. Well, there was a book about it, John objected. So I'm not involved at all. The tractor driver landed. Oh, city folk, don't be sad. It's a man. Robert patted him on the shoulder. Charles says he's going to write a book about all these finds, and he's gonna devote a couple pages to your adventures. Wow, that's cool. Got it. Kevin, how edifying. And an example of what you can get into if you chase the gold of legends, Robert added with a chuckle. And the tractor driver went quiet again. All right, let him have it his way. He's telling the whole truth. After a little thought, he waved his hand. I just remembered. While I was walking to the clearing, I met wolves, a whole pack of them. I had to fight them. We should make sure Charles writes about that too. John, Robert, and Emily looked at each other. For some reason it seemed to them that Kevin had made up the wolves right away and had decided to lie so that Charles could portray him more solidly in the book. Like the brave ones, summer, meanwhile, was coming to an end. The village vacation with all its adventures had flown by like a day. It was time to go back to town. John, although it was a pity to do it, but still sold the house and wished the buyer from the bottom of his heart. And it was the father of a large family and a happy life in it. John also noticed a change in the behavior of his friends between Robert and Emily. Although they might have seemed like complete opposites, there was definitely a relationship developing. They argued with each other less and less, and even had the occasional nice conversation. However, if he forced them to do so, they immediately drifted apart. It was as if the attention to their own personalities found them together. They were somehow embarrassed by it. Also, quite unexpectedly, the village had decided to keep Mars. The dog was always trotting towards Argafai, and John decided that since the spaniel had a love affair, why disturb it? Especially since Charles was not against having 2 dogs living with him. He said he would take good care of them, feed them heartily for preventive care, take them to the vet sometimes. It was a wonderful summer, Robert said as we drove back. But I won't go to the country again, Emily sighed. I won't go next year either, Robert smiled. But I want to go to Mexico. Explore abandoned towns. Are you coming with me? No way in hell, poked Emily. Do you know how dangerous it is in Mexico? John was driving. He smiled. For some reason, he thought the 2 of them would make a great couple. But what about his own personal life? He thought that one day he too would meet a wonderful girl with whom he would be happy. Subscribe and click the bell. Molly was born a sickly, weak little girl. And when old Grandma Nancy looked at her, she immediately said not a survivor. Grandma Nancy, what are you talking about? Said Vanessa. Grandma Molly quietly stroked her daughter Wendy's head. The girl is weak. But so what? We're not all such great men now. And remember, this is after the war. What's there to look forward to? Yes, the time after the war is hard, and everyone needs women. How many of our girls had sons on the field and turned around, and the neighbor went home? Wendy Ottensova gave birth to a daughter without a husband, having spent only one night with a pilot. Yes, nodded the mother at her, but the daughter only waved her hand away. She realized that there were few men left after the war, and those who returned were so to speak, worth their weight in gold. So having sat and cellars a little, Wendy decided just for herself to get a baby. What else does she need? Nothing. Just to feel like a mother to her child. And after all, it's always the continuation of her lineage. But you wanted her to go out, the mother once said in a fit of anger, because she realized that there was one more lineage in the family, and they cannot pull. Mom, didn't you raise me without a father? You gave birth to me unmarried, didn't you? Or have you forgotten? After that, Vanessa just kept quiet and didn't say a word to her daughter. That's true. She gave birth to Wendy, too, by a soldier. But Vanessa was a poor but noble family and knew her lineage almost to the beginning of the reign of Tsar Gorak. And then some obscure abrek came here, wanted her daughter, and that was it. You can't even get alimony from anyone. A daughter. How are we going to live? That's all my mother asked. I work at the bread factory. I work day shifts at night. I can take a part-time job as a watchman. You'll help me. We'll see if we can get the baby back on its feet. What's Molly's father's name anyway? Michael. He's just Michael. The mother just nodded her head and agreed, but not as eager as she could have been. And what happened after the granddaughter was born? Wendy worked 2 jobs to feed her family and buy wood for the furnace. But her health was failing. A cold that started with a trivial fever, then a cough, and then they took Wendy to the graveyard. Wendy to the graveyard. They buried her as best they could. Vanessa herself did not know how she would pull her granddaughter alone, because she was already 3 years old at that time. Don't worry. You're working at the bread factory, aren't you? You'll get by just fine. You'll give her to the kindergarten at the factory. Everything will be fine. That's what the local neighbors said. But Vanessa realized that her money and even the ration cards she received at the factory might not be enough. But gritting her teeth, she went to work every night, knowing that her Ukrainian granddaughter was the only one left at home. All that was left of her Wendy. Tears choked the old woman, for she herself reached out and tried to help everyone. And these, you see, I get a lot of money. I wish you'd all go to hell. What I get, I give back to you, you bastard. And you're just looking for a way to get more. And stab me with my own piece. But the woman realized that she should not give up. After all, who would the little girl be left to? She was only 4 years old, but the little girl was beyond her years. Intelligent and smart, began to talk early. She understood everything, was not capricious. Vanessa, she was the only thing that kept her on this harmful light, and so probably would have gone to the dust by now for her daughter. And the higher powers saw it in a woman to live for another 5 years and to raise at least a little on her feet little girl to send to the 1st grade. Vanessa maybe will register the little girl for permanent residence. The director of the boarding school had known this family for a long time and tried her best to help the grandmother and her granddaughter. It's like Jenna. You don't think I can feed her. She's dressed as well as anyone. She's not newer, but she's not starving. She may have potatoes and bread and whatnot. But you can see for yourself that she's a girl and cheerful. No, you understand. I don't doubt your strength, but the girl will be better off here. 3 meals a day, and we get new clothes from the factory. And I've put together, so to speak, what I could before Molly's package. The uniforms are new, don't you think? And some more of my kids' stuff I'll take care of. Thank you, Jenna, for caring. But you know, home is always better than that. When I'm dead, don't leave my baby behind. And Grandma's words were prophetic. Having finished the 1st grade, Molly and her grandmother were happy that the girl showed the best results in school. Vanessa rejoiced that her daughter had disobeyed and had given birth. And she's an old fool, almost a grandmother. Don't cry. Who hurt you? No one, granddaughter, no one. It's me who's happy about your success, and the fact that God has allowed me to live this time to admire you. Why don't we go to your mother's grave this weekend and visit her? Come on, Grandma, I learned the news at school. I'll tell her. Let her hear it in the next world and be happy. That's how it was decided. The weather was surprisingly nice that Sunday. It wasn't as hot as the day before. A light breeze. That's why it was easy for grandmothers and granddaughters to walk along the beaten path to the edge of the city. And here is the Pogost. The first crosses are already looking beautifully. This is where I be buried, thought the old woman, but immediately chased away such thoughts. There's nothing to think like that. She has a child in her arms, and smiling Vanessa stroked her granddaughter's head. Grandma, I'll give my mother a field of cornflowers. Let her enjoy the flowers. Okay, granddaughter, but I won't go far into the field. Just over the road here, pluck them for me to see. I was an old lady watching Molly pick wildflowers for her mother's grave. She had long been invested with doubts, should the girls speak, or wait a little longer. About the old warehouse bricked up in the wall of her old barracks. Vanessa was moved there almost immediately after the revolution, along with her parents, and they managed to grab a few small struggles in their haste, along with the family jewelry and a small bag of Tsarist coins. The family had stashed them in an old niche that had once been a heating vent. It was good that it was not used at that time, and that's why it turned out to be a wonderful hiding place. Vanessa knew about this stash, as well as her mother's and father's instructions before his death, that all this stuff should be taken only in case of emergency. Vanessa, I got you jammed by God. Sell jewelry only in case of emergency. Or better yet, don't touch it at all. Mommy, I understand. But if things get really bad. Vanessa, just so you understand what your mother said, I don't mind you selling it, but it's your legacy. You're the heir to a noble, albeit united, family. And I hope that this red scourge in the form of the Red Army will die out in due time. And then Mother coughed in another fit, overcoming his illness. Then you'll be able to claim your ancestry. Your great-grandmother was an empress herself. Mom, we're going to be fine. Well, we're not. Her mother died, as well as her father from tuberculosis, leaving Vanessa to live in a communal apartment. The girl was already an adult and had the best education, so she easily got a job as a German teacher in a school and worked there until her old age. But now she had to go as a night watchman. Well, thank goodness Molly's talking or not. What about the treasure? Since her father and mother passed away, and she only took one antique ring from her daughter. My daughter needed the money for her medication, but that didn't help either. And now to tell them to a small child, even one as bright as Molly. The old woman sighed heavily and pushed the wicket gate of the local Pogost, almost half abandoned, about there being a local watchman, someone to watch over all the graves. It was out of the question. Just her and a few other parishioners who came here to see their dead. That's all. But hello, Evelyn. Molly and Molly are here to see you. Your daughter's coming over. She's gone to pluck some daisies besides cornflowers. And I'm not here yet. I want to consult with you. And the old woman sat down on an old ruined bench. Fix your handkerchief. She used to talk to her dead daughter like that at the grave. And the amazing thing was that Evelyn often came to her in her dreams and even gave her hints on what to do. That pleased Vanessa. It meant that her daughter could hear her, even in her dreams, but she was communicating with her. You realize, Evelyn, what's the matter? I can already feel my own demise. I'll see you in the next world soon. I'm not worried about Molly. She'll be fine. I mean, the principal of her school promised me she'd look after her. If anything, they'll put her in an orphanage or a boarding school. But should I tell her about the treasure buried in the wall? She's young and foolishly childish. She might have said too much. But to leave them to their fate like that. It's an old house. It'll either collapse or be torn down. And I won't last forever. What do I do? Give me a hint. But at that moment, Molly ran up to the grave and put a bouquet of daisies and cornflowers by the headboard. The girl was dreaming of running, and her braided tassels and hair glistened gold in the sun. Here, Mom, I brought you some wildflowers. Grandma says, do you like them? Grandma, what did you want to talk to Mom about? She's writing to her. What kind of gas? She hears everything. That's later, when my mother gives me an answer in my dream. Let me tell you, in the meantime, put some cakes on your mother's grave. Let her soul eat them. And the old woman handed her granddaughter 2 poppy seed cakes. Evelyn loved them very much when she was alive. Let her eat them like this. Vanessa wiped her tears. She shouldn't have shown her weakness in front of her granddaughter, or upset the child. And so the 2 generations sat on the grave, embraced and listened to the silence. Bird song and the wind slipping in the trees. Well, granddaughter, you've seen your mother, so let's go home. And you, Evelyn, rest. We won't bore you, and I'll be waiting for you in my dream tonight. You really only put your granddaughter to bed. And went to bed herself, as she immediately went to sleep. And so the woman sees her Evelyn Wushu. She is standing on a hill where their old house can be seen and points to their own windows. And then the house collapses, and in its place a high-rise rises out of the ground. So fast, and on top of it stands Molly. But the strangest thing about Molly is that she sees her not as a little girl, but as a grown-up lady, and so beautifully dressed. "Oh, Lord, have mercy," Vanessa said, opening her eyes. "But thank you, daughter. I guess I should tell you about the treasure, and I guess you can see it from up there. How will our Molly live?" She got up and crossed herself in front of the icons, looked at her watch. Wow, she fell asleep at 400 hours. It's time to get up before tomorrow to cook the stove to stoke and feed the baby. When the table was set, the grandmother twitched something behind which stood the bed, granddaughter, and lightly stroked her hair. "Get up. The pancakes with jam are ready." "Grandma, why such luxury? I can make my granddaughter happy once in a while. And we have a conversation to have." The girl quickly jumped out of bed, slipped her bare feet into slippers, and went to wash her face, when gradually and stroking grandmother and dress was put on, and her hair was invented into 2 tight braids. Mo, as she was called by her household, Molly sat down at the table. There was no limit to her surprise. There was homemade milk and pancakes on the table, her favorite raspberry jam, eggs. "Grandma, where's the money coming from?" "That's none of your granddaughter's business. You'd better eat something. And then we should talk over a cup of tea." When the girl had eaten and Vanessa poured herself a cup of tea, she sat opposite and thought she didn't know how to start. But she realized that her days were numbered. And she had to start this difficult conversation. "Molly, you're a girl, smart, and almost an adult. So understand me, you may soon be gone, so you may be alone." "Grandma, what are you talking about? I'll marry you, and you'll take care of my kids." "God willing, girl, but you'd better listen." Here the woman stood up and pointed to a place in the wall, above which stood an unmarred typewriter. "Hidden in this wall are the family jewels, the coins, and they were left here by your great-grandfather and great-grandmother, and strictly punished. I'm not to touch them. I only took out an antique ring once and sold it to try to cure your mom." "Grandma, why are you telling me this?" "My little girl, my mommy and daddy told me that this is a treasure to be treasured. It's not just gold, it's magical in a way. You see, Molly, these jewels are our legacy, a gift from the Empress herself, and they'll be used to admit you to the nobility when you grow up. It's like your passport, high society, and you'll be able to take your proper position in society without the miserable existence that the revolution has brought you." "Grandma, don't interrupt me. I know what I'm saying, so now I'll get to the most important thing. Do you know where the treasure lies? And when I'm gone, don't tell anyone about it, and don't talk about it now. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Grandma, but I don't understand." "If I die, you have to stay here and keep the treasure." Emily sat back and nodded understandingly, but she really couldn't understand why she was telling her all this, because her beloved grandmother would live for a long time. Though the girl listened attentively and tried to understand everything. "Grandma, if I can't cope." This thought had already crossed her mind, and the woman just did not know how to act. She really realized that the girl might not be able to cope with the task. Though, on the other hand, she couldn't just leave the treasure in the wall and not tell anyone about it either. Vanessa kept thinking about this question when her heart first seized up, and she realized that at her age it might fail. I'm sure you can handle it. After all, one thing you have to realize is that this is your pass to the top, your ticket to better things. If not, you'll have to live not as a princess, but as a working girl. But if you do, you need to rehide them. You agree? She knew her granddaughter's character well, and if you get her interested in something, the girl would do it. And now she hoped that Molly would be able to keep the secret of her family, and in the future she would be able to proudly declare her family, and I suppose, her status in society, and a clan that would not be forgotten and would not fade into oblivion. Molly smiled and nodded her head. She understood her grandmother perfectly well, loved her. That's why she made a vow about herself. With all her might she would try to fulfill her errand. But apparently, having freed herself from the mystery that oppressed her, Vanessa had already gone down with high blood pressure by evening. It must be nerves, she thought. I'll take some pills and sleep. And then, God willing, I'll get up early. Although in the morning in the house, there was a grief Vanessa gave up at 0:00, God's soul, leaving on this world little Molly. Getting up in the morning, the girl did not hear the usual footsteps of her grandmother, and the room was cool, and on the table was not her usual simple breakfast of porridge and a glass of milk. "Grandma, I'm up, where are you?" Molly shouted loudly. But when she stepped out of the partition and into the main part of the room, Vanessa was sitting in a chair near the window, her head tilted to the side, staring at the wall with open eyes. Molly almost shrieked, but clamped her hands over her mouth in time, and she remembered all too well her grandmother's admonition to stay in this house with all her might. But what was she to do? She just didn't know. After all, she was just a little girl who had been left a complete orphan one morning. Molly stood and silently cried, not knowing how to be, what to do. The girl approached her grandmother, began to shake her quietly by the hand, but this did not revive the old Vanessa in any way. From such a stupor, she was brought out of such a stupor by a knock at the door and knocked neighbor from the next room, loudly calling Vanessa. But Molly did not open the door. If anything, she would say later that her grandmother was at the market. She instantly realized that something had to be done with Grandma's body, but with her tapes, that she could only lower her to the floor, put her under the window and cover her with a blanket. Molly quickly spun Grandma's body down on the floor, covered her with the blanket, trying to lay her closer to the window with her small hands. She folded her arms and closed her beloved grandmother's eyes and cried involuntarily again. After all, it is difficult to survive such a thing. An adult is not like a child. After that, the girl carefully left the room, closing it on the key. "Molly, where is Grandma?" The words of the neighbor sounded like thunder. "Grandma went to the market," she said quickly, and promptly jumped out of the old barack. Molly raced to the cemetery where her mother was buried, for she simply did not know what she should do next. And now, sitting on an old bench near her mother's grave, the girl cried and complained to her that her grandmother had died, and now she was all alone. "Mammy, I just don't know how I can go on living. The grocery cards are enough for a month. Grandma has some money, but she told me to keep our family treasures." The girl cried, and when there was no strength left at all, she quietly slid down to the ground, curled up in a ball, and clasped her knees with her hands and fell asleep. She slept until almost evening, and then she got up and went home quietly. "Molly, where have you been, and where is grandmother?" Insistent neighbors tried to talk to the little girl, but she persistently kept silent. "It's all right. Grandma went to a friend, and I stayed here. Keep an eye on me." "Schoolteacher, you're sure about that?" The neighbor looked at the girl strangely, but she didn't want to get involved. This whole family was weird. "If you need help, you're welcome." The girl nodded her head and quickly headed to her room. She found money and cards for groceries. She started to buy and prepare food herself, but she tried to avoid the body under the blanket. But she realized that she could not go on like this for long, although she did not know how to be. But the neighbors saw the little girl herself going to the market to store, and the once caring Vanessa simply disappeared. And so at the next meeting of neighbors, it was decided to break into the room of old Vanessa and check what happened there. The absence of a neighbor. A strange odor was coming from the room. The child's behavior alarmed everyone who lived in the house and yard. Vanessa, Molly, open up. It's your neighbors. What's going on? The girl jumped out of bed, rushed around the room, did not know what to do. If the neighbors suddenly found the corpse of her grandmother, she would be put in an orphanage. And there, according to stories, she would be beaten and starved. But most importantly, she would not be able to keep her grandmother's word and preserve her own legacy. At that moment, the knocking on the door stopped, and a commotion was heard behind them. The girl did not know what was going on, so she tiptoed to the door and listened. Soon Molly heard the voice of their local Uncle Michael. Vanessa, open up, please. Molly, girl, can you hear me? I know one of you is definitely home. There's a strange odor coming from under your door. The policemen began to listen, but heard only the stomping of children's feet running from the door. Aha, so the girl is home and most likely alone. Where's Vanessa? It's not like she could leave the little girl for that long. Gotta break down the door. The policeman waved to the locksmith Stepanovich. We must carefully open the door so as not to damage the lock. Otherwise, Vanessa won't get off me later. The locksmith nodded understandingly and began to carefully open the lock. Which one? What kind of lock is there? A flimsy lock, which can be opened with a simple pin. When the locksmith and the neighbor entered the room, the smell of death hit them in the nose, and before their eyes opened a picture on the windowsill. In front of the open window sat crying Molly. My baby girl. What's wrong? A kind-hearted neighbor, with whom old Vanessa was more or less friends, rushed to the girl. But when she took the crying child off the windowsill and cast a glance at the body covered with a blanket, she immediately realized everything, shrieked. She immediately pressed the child's head against her shoulder and turned around so that she wouldn't see it. But what was there not to see? It looked like she had been living with this nightmare for almost a month. Here it was already. Yeah, where had Vanessa gone? Quietly said the precinct officer, who walked over to the body and lifted the bedspread. No wonder she'd been gone for almost a month. How on earth did you live, baby girl, next to the body? He looked closely at Molly, whom he had known since birth. Yes, in fact, as well as her late mother and grandmother. And just shook his head. Call the paramedics and the investigative team. Don't take me to the orphanage, I'll be lost there. Molly's voice sounded especially loud in the silence. Plushenko, do not worry. You are still, no one is not taking you anywhere. No one. But the girl has to go somewhere. She can't live here by herself. The investigator realized the absurdity of the situation. But what to do? Why are you clamoring? Let the little girl stay with me for a while. The neighbor, who took the first girl in her arms, immediately made a decision. Let her live. She has enough space, and money to feed another family is enough. And then look, you can and claim for this room. It will be just right. A place for my son to live if he decides to marry. Are you sure about that, Camille? The policeman knew that the girl would be better off here than in an orphanage. But that's none of his business. Let social services handle it. Yeah, I'm sure. I work with my son on bread at the factory, so it won't be a problem to feed her. All right, take the little girl in for now, and then we'll decide what to do with her. Decide what? I'll take custody and that's it. What's that orphanage gonna give her? She's just a kid, and she's not very bright. Molly was a smart girl, and she knew she could stay here. That's it. The main thing now is to convince Aunt Nadia to keep her. And let everyone think what they want, but she really need to stay in this room or next door to look after the ordinary treasures. Molly clung tightly to her roommate's neck and cried, nervous overstrain, and the morning situation itself did not have the best effect on her psyche. She quickly picked up the baby and took her to her room. asking her to stay here and she would come back. "Molly, I'll be right back." And what's up and how well the girl wiped her tears and nodded her head. She realized that now her fate was being decided and she had to stay. There was nowhere to go. Camille returned to the old Vanessa's room and caught the moment the body was being carried out of the room. At that minute, a piece and an arm slipped out from under the bedspread. At what she saw, the neighbor cried out, "Aunt Camille, don't leave me." Vi voice running from Molly's room made the woman turn away from what she saw. She hugged her little body tightly and pulled her close to her. "I won't leave you, sweetie. Don't worry." "Why did you leave the room? You promised you'd stay with me." "Can I have my doll?" "It's on the bed." "Molly, wait for the coroner. He'll leave and you can take it." "I don't think so." "Let him take it now," the precinct says. "We then print the room, and no one will go in there until the investigator gives the okay. And at the house service, they'll register the room for her. Then the room will be in the girl's name." Camille didn't hide her joy, because she could get custody of her, and then yes, by law, she is the heir to the room, and no one can claim it. The neighbor nodded her head and smiled to herself. Molly had heard all of this as well, happy that she wouldn't be put in an orphanage and could guard the walled treasure. In fact, that's what happened. Investigators determined that the old lady died of a heart attack. The baby was given into the care of a neighbor, who did not hesitate and immediately moved into the room of the cat Vanessa, leaving her son. But Camille was not given to rest. 2 questions: why the girl is so afraid of the orphanage, and whether there was any inheritance left from Vanessa. Though she was a mean old woman, she was the scion of a penniless noble family. "Molly, can you tell me, please? My grandmother had something left, but not towels, but some jewelry and stuff." "No, Grandma had a ring. But when Mom got sick, she sold it, even though the doctor said we couldn't save her in time." "I see," but that answer didn't suit Camille. After all, she realized that only an old woman with a treasure chest could walk around with her head held high like that. But how could she know that? Emily might not even know that. Where does the old woman keep the treasure? I mean, who would tell a child that? God forbid she'd hang around or be dragged out into the light of day. But how wrong was she? One day after this conversation, Camille decided to carefully examine the room, maybe even tread the walls and floor. What if the woman you escorted the girl outside? Let her play. She had no business being out here. She gave her a potato pie and her favorite doll. "Go play outside. I'll take over here." "Okay, Aunt Camille. Why don't I help you?" "No need. What can you do with your little hands?" The girl nodded her head and looked askew at the woman. She certainly didn't like being chased out of her own room. But what could she do at that point? Molly took another pie from the table and swiftly left the room, directing her life in the direction of the old cemetery to her mother's grave. She wanted to feed her mother's soul, to grieve as her grandmother had grieved, communing with Evelyn's portrait. Well, that was nice. Apparently ran to the cemetery to see her deadbeat mom, Camille said, looking out the window where the girl had gone. She was really getting fed up. She's been eating out of her mind. There's no work for her. Just spend food on her, dress her with cards. But on the other hand, how will she get this room? She's just looking after this one. And then she'll think of something, marry her son and get married herself. And this one to an orphanage or something. Camille moved away from the window and looked around the room with her eyes. Where could the old rich woman keep her treasures? That Vanessa had gotten something from her, she knew for sure. After all, it could not be that the descendants of a noble family had not brought at least a handful of coins with them in the Revolution. But judging by the condition of the walls, it was impossible to make a hiding place in them. That left only the underground, and Camille began to knot her heel. The floor. But a thud indicated that there were no voids or niches there either. Oh, what the hell. Did you, Vanessa? That's the only ring I had. And I gave it to a dead man. And she even left that one herself. The woman with vexation then hit the floor with her foot, and so hard that a squirrel sprinkled from the wall of the stove. She didn't know where and how to look for the treasure, but she realized that they were here. Vanessa put locks on the doors for a reason, right? Yes, she also wanted to put bars on the windows. Then the neighbors still began to laugh at her. That say, you promised a noblewoman to steal from you. Though everyone for a minute wondered whether the woman was not for nothing, guarding her room like that. Well, we should invite an apprentice. Let him check the stove too. Maybe he'll find something inside. Just who to invite? The woman realized that if you call from the outside and in the oven or chimney, really something will be, then certainly such a treasure will not be able to hide. You'd have to share it or give it to the state. I'll have to think about it. And the woman left the room, closing it with 2 turns of the key. Nice German lock. These foreigners know how to make them. They're flimsy, you can pick them with a knife and just open them. In these minutes, Molly reached the grave of her mother, next to which her grandmother was buried. The girl divided the pie in half and put each one on the grave. She sat down on the bench where her grandmother had sat earlier and began to communicate with her relatives. Mom, Grandma, I feel bad without you. True, Aunt Camille. She's nice, but Grandma, I remember your instruction and keep it safe. I don't tell anyone about the treasure, but I think my aunt guesses. Is that you, Grandma? Come to my house in a dream. What should I do? What to do? And the girl wiped the tears that mercilessly hailed from her eyes. She was a little girl on whom the adults laid an impossible labor and task, and there was no one to consult with. Molly had friends, and even friends from among the yard boys who protected her from her elders, always treated her to apples. But that wasn't it. She simply had no one to talk to, and tormenting her soul with all her doubts. Okay, Mom, Grandma, I love you, but I'm going. I think Aunt Camille will be looking for the treasure hidden in the wall of the stove, so I don't have to leave the room for too long. And you'll pardon me if I don't come long, but I'll come and get you some food. And Molly got up and walked briskly home. But in her smallness and inexperience, the girl did not turn around and look at the place when she spoke of the treasure hidden in the wall of the stove, and her words were heard by ears to which the information itself was in no way intended, and a dark figure stepped quietly away from the thick bush and weaved its way down the old path. In this gatehouse, which had formerly belonged to the cemetery keeper, had taken up residence with Michael, an old front man. Michael had come from the front a long time ago and wanted to find his first and probably only love, but couldn't. He was told that Wendy had been resting in the graveyard for a long time. They even pointed out the grave. Since then, the man has been living in the gatehouse. He's been living here for 6 months now. He looks after the old graves sometimes, and he's waiting to see who's going to visit his Wendy's grave. Probably 3 months ago, the man noticed a poppy seed cake on Wendy's grave, just the way the woman liked it. Strange, who could have brought it to him? Good people told him Wendy's mother was still alive. Yeah, I think she is. She's got a little girl, a little girl, a little girl. And the timeline fits. Could it be his blood? But he was afraid to admit to himself that a lone wolf like that had a child. No, we have to look. Maybe it's not my baby. But the moment Molly came to the grave, all doubts simply fell away. The girl 1 in 1 was his copy of the same as his hair, almost red color, eyes and nose with a small hump. And the voice. No, it was exactly like his. But what treasure was the child talking about? It's weird. Did Wendy have untold treasures, and now they're all left to the girls? And who is this auntie? Camille. My God, is everyone after these cats? And nobody cares about the kid. She just walks from here to the other side of town like that. Where to? The old cemetery. No, we should definitely go back to Wendy's house and see what's going on. Apparently, the girl is Wendy and his daughter. And left alone, she's simply in trouble. But what about the treasure? He threw the cigarette butt under his feet and crushed it with his boot. He began to think about what to do. Should he go today or tomorrow? No, there's no need to be so hot. Reconnaissance. I'll go tomorrow morning. I'll look and ask. And then already. The man went back to the old lady and took his suitcase out from under the bed. He looked at the unpretentious stuff he brought from the war and his award-winning nagant. You didn't get much in Berlin intelligence. At least you could have nibbled one German. It's all right with him. You're not a thief. You're an intelligence captain. You shouldn't be in this line of work. And the man took civilian pants out of his suitcase and threw them on a nail by the door. Tomorrow, I'll have something to change into. There was nothing to show off the uniform. Already rare visitors of the Pogost began to pay attention to him. They might call the local police. Let them call him. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He stayed here because he had nowhere else to stay. His house was bombed, and the local military commission wouldn't listen. They said, "You're not from here. You're not entitled to housing. Not even a corner. Go to your place." But the man, being a native of Siberia, came here on purpose to find his niche after so many years. He remembered her as a young and happy carcass with whom fate had brought him together at the train station and with whom he had spent only one night. The man's heart snapped because he was so afraid that she would not wait for him, would marry someone else, although everything turned out to be more prosaic and tragic. From the train station, the man rushed to Wendy's house, where he was simply put on notice. She died of a cold. Buried at this and that. And there's a mother and her daughter living in the apartment. Was she married? Did his heart race? No, she never was. She gave birth to a daughter by some soldier. That's all. A soldier. So she traded him for a soldier. What? Apparently, the love there was stronger, so to speak, until the grave. And the girl, but when she saw Molly's graves in the cemetery near Nancy, the man realized how wrong he was. This is the little girl of his blood, and he will try to do everything to adopt her, and then take her to his native village, to show his mother and prove to everyone that he is not an empty color and not an empty voice. In the village, Michael had long been notorious for not marrying, because he was not strong as a man, nor can he have children, though on the other hand, none of his battle girlfriends complained about his strength, and the fact that he couldn't have children, it came out by itself without consequences. And now he would prove to everyone that he had a daughter and was a copy of her father. The man smiled, and his soul became warmer from such thoughts. He lay down on the old bed near the stove and, throwing his hands behind his head, began to think, if Molly is his daughter, if she knows where the treasure is, then you can not only come home with an heiress, but also a rich man. Michael had heard many stories that the nobility after the revolution had managed to sneak away some of their wealth, and some even hid it so securely that there are still untold treasures lying in many caches. Come on, that's not the point, but it's for your education, my little girl. He lay there thinking about how he'd come home, how he'd show that little girl to everyone. He would build a house of solid logs, bring his parents there, and then give his daughter to the City Institute. Michael didn't even notice how he was hovering in the clouds. He fell asleep, but the dream itself was restless. He suddenly had a vision of Evelyn in his vision. She had never come to him in his dreams before. And now here was Michael. "Save our child, save our child." She waved at him and then disappeared. The man woke up in a cold sweat, himself not realizing what it was. His heart was pounding frantically on his forehead. Large drops of sweat were oozing, and his breathing was cut short. Jesus, what a dream. He looked out of the window. It was already getting dark outside, so he had slept a long time. 6 or 7 hours. That's okay. The body itself knows perfectly well how much to rest, how much to sleep and eat and drink water. Although it's worth getting up, making tea and heating the stove. Summer is warm during the day, but the nights can still be damp and cool. Michael got out of bed and put his feet into his Kurzovy boots, went outside, looked around and took some large logs from the fields. He looked up at the sky and remembered his Evelyn, how he had missed her all those years during the war. And then when he returned to civilian life and started looking for his family. But everything will be fine now. He knows that. Warming a small stove, Michael put a kettle on the stove, threw a handful of automaton herbs in it. Thanks, Grandma, for teaching me. I won't forget you. I hope you'll help me bring my daughter back to her father's house. Having drunk the tea, Michael went to the doorstep and sat down. He took out tobacco and paper, rolled a wet duck, took a drag, and for a mushy plum. He looked at the duck and threw it on the ground. What an infestation! It had eaten through all the lungs. We must throw it. If there's a child in the house, you'll throw it yourself too. What child are you talking about? Honey. Michael jumped from surprise and turned around and looked at the real woman in front of him. Who are you? Don't be afraid, I'm Camille. He's just been going to the cemetery. My pupil girl is so light, and Molly has not seen. Camille didn't go to the cemetery for nothing. She looked all over old Vanessa's room, but she couldn't find any hiding place. Then it occurred to her that the treasure might be hidden in the cemetery, buried in Evelyn's grave, for instance. Not for nothing the old cargo from there often showed, not thinking long to feed Molly Koi-sun. Woman, she threw her handkerchief and sweater and went to the old cemetery. What if? But as she walked, Camille realized that it was unrealistic to find treasure there. It's not an old crypt, not some funeral structure, but a grave. But it's true, she wouldn't dig up and bury the treasure every time. But she's already gone. It was worth checking out. Camille walked through the cemetery and decided to look in the old cemetery path. And lo and behold, sitting on the doorstep was a military man, smoking himself, the meek, and talking about the baby. Talking. Camille realized that Michael had come here from the front to look for his family, Evelyn and his daughter. What kind of Evelyn are you looking for? Not the one buried next to Grandma Vanessa. Oh yeah. Michael stood up in surprise. He'd found someone who could tell his daughter about Evelyn and her life. So, who were you to her? Wasn't she Molly's father? Well, don't spoil it for her. I've taken custody of Evelyn's daughter. Her paperwork's all in order. But I wanted to check with Evelyn about the father, but she's dead, I guess. I saw the girl here at her mother's grave, and I understand her grandmother is buried here. Yeah, the little girl comes here a lot. When Vanessa was alive, she used to take her to the grave, and then she left after her daughter. I can talk to her, but that girl is Molly. If that's my daughter, I'll take her. Don't worry. I'm not gonna leave you alone. And if you want, I'll leave you Evelyn's room too. Believe me. Is it true? You'll take the girl. You're gonna leave me the room. As the baby's father, Camille grinned at the man and had already lost her hands. This was the solution to her many problems. She gets rid of an unnecessary burden in her face. Defke gets that coveted square footage. Yes, plus if the treasure is left in the room, Camille can easily search it from floor to ceiling, up to the point that the floors will tear to the concrete. The man himself saw the advantage of making a deal with Camille. She would know exactly who the baby's father was. Yes, if he could interest her with a ringing message, the aunt would have no problem giving him custody of the girl. Paternal custody. And you don't worry, if you help me, if you don't force me to give her rights, I'll leave her without even saying a word. Camille looked at him askance. He's not an alcoholic or a fool. He's a good-looking man. He wouldn't cheat. She did a quick calculation. All the odds, and nodded. So be it. The wool of the lousy sheep. Good, then let the girl stay with me for a while, and you get the paperwork together. What else do you need at social services? And by the way, you can't bring a house in town on your own. It's her cemetery here. Okay. Camille turned around and was to the exit from the Pogost, but stopping, turned back and spoke. I stopped by the other day. She did not visit the grave of Evelyn and old Vanessa. No need to show this strange occupant of the Pogost for now. Where could the treasure be hiding? And Michael's already forgotten about the treasure. I'm glad his suspicions have been confirmed, so he can take the little girl away unhindered. Hell, yeah. What about the treasure? He didn't even think of that. And this is Camille going on the attack. I don't know if she knows where it is. That's why she's keeping the baby for now. It's weird. But if the woman knows there's treasure in the room and the girl knows exactly where it is, Molly's in danger. What do we do? Just walk in on your daughter and say, "Hi, baby girl, I'm your daddy. Let's pack up the treasure and go before I'm either taken to the Neuf house or put in the penitentiary." No, you don't want to just do this out of the blue. We need to think this through. We need to do some recon. And then, the man sat down on the bench and began to think. He realized he shouldn't scare the little girl like that. And to begin with, it is necessary to get acquainted with her, but that would be tomorrow, and tonight to sleep. The man entered the house, and having closed the door on a bolt, lay down on a bench, covered with a warm overcoat. He slept that night, Michael restlessly. And no wonder. So much to experience, so much new information and discoveries. It's no wonder that sleep fell from his feet. The man dreamt of Nadia, strangely enough, pregnant little Molly. And the strangest thing was the old Vanessa, who he had never seen in person. Only on the cell phone picture, Vanessa was standing in the middle of the room in his dream, and he was pointing his finger at the sand latch. But what was strange was that he was asleep, and he could smell the smell of burning. No, it wasn't his, not the cinders in his dream. Michael jumped impetuously out of bed, and out of military habit, slipped his feet into his boots behind his eyes. There were puffs of smoke in the room, and the roof was crackling with tongues of flame that were just breaking out. How in time had he managed to wake up? Apparently, someone had either gotten under the roof or the roof itself caught fire from some unknown cause. He grabbed his field bag and sprinted outside before he fully realized what had happened. But Michael didn't see Camille looking at him from behind the bushes, who decided to check out the soldier who lived in the cemetery. She threw a torch on the roof and quickly hid behind the thick bushes, and from there she watched what this strange soldier, who had come from nowhere and intended to take her girl, would do. Yes, he wanted the girl, she believed. He wants the treasure. He's not gonna give me a room unless he canvasses. They've all been rented out. We've seen the likes of them. After the front, they come in, spin around, and then things, chickens and food disappear. Let him spin. He jumped out with his duffel bag. But you forgot your suitcase, so you're not as simple as you turn out to be, my good man. The woman saw the man wiping his eyes and coughing, and then the helper walked toward town. That's what you should do. In the meantime, I'll search Evelyn's grave for treasure, but there was no treasure, though the woman searched very carefully. Meanwhile, Michael threw his bag over his shoulders and walked toward town. Come on, with this road burned. So it would only speed up his relocation to the city. But where to go? Maybe straight to his daughter's house. He thought and headed for the place where Evelyn used to live, and he was not mistaken in his choice. When Michael approached the house, he stopped and looked around at the grandmothers on the benches, children in the sandbox. Everything as it should be in peaceful life. Patsana in the forehead, then play. It's nice. It's like there was no war, no grief and human suffering. And here's Molly with her doll playing alone without her friends. What can I say? Maybe there are no girls here. Maybe that's a good thing. So I'll meet my daughter without witnesses. And then how will the conversation go? Maybe she won't recognize her father, won't want to know or see him. Michael carefully approached the girl and quietly said, "Molly, it's you." Molly jerked at the voice of a strange man and looked at him carefully from under her forehead with her smart gray eyes. Yes, my eyes are my blood, Michael thought and smiled. There are dimples in her cheeks, just like his narrow lips, a stern look, and eyebrows arched like Evelyn's. Why did Aunt Camille send you? No, Molly, I wanted to talk to you. You realize I'm your daddy. My name is Michael, your mom, and I didn't know each other long, but then you were born. You're my daughter, you know. Molly sat on the curb and couldn't say anything. She understood what this strange man was saying, but she just couldn't believe it. After all, Grandma had always said she had no one. And if Grandma died, she'd be put in an orphanage. I don't believe you. The girl shouted across the courtyard. Everyone heard her. And now already playing noodles, guys, and sitting on the bench, old ladies began to look closely at the strange man. Some of them even stood up and walked over. Little wonder what kind of souvenir wants to offend a child so easily. Man, who are you? Why are you bothering our Molly? The woman's voice was harsh. She was a species woman, and even at her age, she could easily hit anyone with a stick without looking at their strength. She looked at the man and realized she'd seen him somewhere before. You're not the man who went to Molly's mother's house 9 or 10 years ago. Yeah, that's me. It's just, I'm Molly's father, and I've only just managed to get here. I was wounded after the front, hospitalized, then rehab. I just recently found out I had a daughter, so I decided to come here, to come and take her with me. Where were you when Evelyn was dying? When Vanessa was pulling a baby girl on her own bloodline? When Sophia died, the only one left, and the neighbor nodded her head at the baby girl sitting at their feet like an abandoned puppy? Yes, you understand. I only just now found out she existed, that I had a daughter. Not to mention the fact that there's grief here. I'm ready to make amends. You think that's the only place a penal battalion buys their guilt? No, I'm a captain. Reconnaissance, so please be respectful. And yes, I am Molly's father, and I want to take her. And don't be afraid to take her room for yourself. Camille's voice sounded sudden, loud, and overpowered all the voices of the yard captives. I'm the girl's legal guardian, and I won't let you take her. Come on, Camille. Weren't you the one who told me yesterday at the cemetery that you were ready to give the girl and her dependents to her legal father? But I have to give you Molly's room. Or was that not the case? The woman pressed her lips together quickly, not knowing what to say to that statement. After all, the fact that she had gone to the old cemetery had been seen by many. To deny it was to invite even more suspicion. Yes, I did. But then I thought about it and decided, what if you're some kind of crook and you want the girl? For some obscure business. How can you prove you're her father? The baby's birth certificate only lists the potential father's name. I can see the birth certificate. Are you really my father? Molly's voice sounded low, quiet, but everyone heard her question. Yes, Molly, are you my daughter? Mommy probably said you don't have a father, but here I am. You look at me and yourself in the mirror. How do we look alike? By the way, she's from before the breakup. Well, your mom gave me this antique and magical pen mirror, and Michael pulled an antique mirror out of a duffel bag. It had a long stem made of golden metal. It glistened in the sunlight, casting bunny glints all over it. Wow, that's right. Real gold. Camille thought to herself, and stared at the antique. Must be worth a lot of money, huh? That bitch Vanessa. She said she had no money, and here she was giving away such things left and right. The mirror itself was made of real gold, and Evelyn gave it to Michael as a keepsake. Let there be something left of their inheritance. At that moment, the woman did not believe that they would be able to keep the wealth. The time was too hard and hungry. Although Michael carried it with him all through the war and in the post-war years without breaking or scratching it, now he showed it to his daughter. It's really my mom's mirror. My grandmother told me about it, although she always scolded my mother for giving the mirror without her permission. Well, it's true. You're a daddy. And the girl threw herself around Michael's neck, hugged him, and began kissing his stubble and floor and cheeks. The man simply could not restrain himself and also kissed and stroked his daughter's head, pouring tears, which did not shed for all the years of war. And what to hold back his emotions now? They had found each other and everything would be fine. Daddy, you won't put me in an orphanage for anything. We'll stay at your grandmother's and Mom's room for now. And then, citizen, show me your papers. The policeman was called by the neighbors. Not many people believed that Molly had found her father, or rather he had found her. It all looked too suspiciously good. Michael put his daughter on the ground and took the duffel bag off his shoulder. At the same time, he noticed with the corner of his eye how the policeman's hand twitched and reached for his gun. Yes, of course, the sergeant was in no hurry to pull out his gun. "I'm from intelligence. Here are my passport and military ID." And he handed the documents to the policeman, who began to scrutinize them, checking the photo and the man's face. Yes, it looks like he really is a scout. Although on the one hand, after the war, there is no telling what kind of scum is coming into the city. But the policeman couldn't find anything to pick on the documents, and he asked what business he was in town on. "Yes, you see, I was looking for my family, but I found only my daughter. So, citizen, let's go to the nearest police station. There we'll check your documents and the authenticity of your words. Maybe it's not your daughter at all, and you want to hurt her." But then Molly jumped into her father's arms and screamed, "I'm not letting him go anywhere. He's my daddy. I don't have anyone else. I don't want to go to an orphanage." "Don't listen to that girl. She's been living with her dead grandmother for a month. She must be out of her mind." When Camille said those words, Michael almost fainted. How could it be? A small child, and lived next to a corpse for a month. It just didn't make sense. What the hell are you doing? Inhumans, how could you let this little baby live next to a dead man? Even the Germans couldn't do that. Michael just didn't understand how it could happen that he picked up the little girl in his arms like that and looked at the policeman, nodding his head. "Come on, brother. Take us to your nearest station. We'll find a solution for these good neighbors." The policeman himself stood white as chalk from what he had heard. After all, even having been through the war, he could not imagine that in peacetime such a thing was possible. He nodded his head and led the father and daughter to the station. The girl put her arms around her father's neck and quietly moaned in his ear, "Daddy, you really won't leave me?" "No, of course not, my dear child. I won't leave you. We'll live happily ever after in my new home. But don't tell anyone about the policy yet. There's a hidden treasure in my room with my mom and grandma. I'll tell you later." "Okay, but don't tell anyone else about it yet. That's what my grandmother told me. It's my pass to a better life." "It's okay, daughter. It's gonna be okay. Just don't worry." Already in the station, Michael and little Molly were given tea and porridge from the soldiers' canteen and sent to the office of the investigator, who was in charge of the case of the death of the grandmother of the girl's old Vanessa. "Well, tell me, Molly, who's that with you?" "That's my dad. He's going to take me and Nadia away from the orphanage." "That's good. But tell me, did Aunt Camille ever hurt you?" "Yes, she said all sorts of mean things about my mom and grandma. Then she threatened me that she would give me to the orphanage." "That's what she said." The investigator was surprised by the girl's words. Camille seemed really kind and friendly. "And now this." "Yes, she thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. I was lying quietly under the blanket, and I heard everything. Aunt Camille said she was going to put me in an orphanage, let them starve me there because I'm bursting. And then I froze to death from the cold there in winter. But I have a daddy now, and I'll go with him." "And where does your daddy intend to take the baby?" "I hope you have your own place." The investigator realized how serious and responsible this decision was. "Don't worry, comrade investigator. I'm from Siberia myself. I have my parents' house. I'll come back with my daughter and build the log cabin. But you understand, while I have to draw up the documents for my daughter, so that I could get the appropriate certificate and write it in my passport, I may live where her mother and grandmother lived. It's on Severny 32. The investigator looked in the records of the deceased Vanessa. "Yes, Uncle Investigator," Molly said quietly. "Mom and Grandma lived there with me. Let Daddy live there." The investigator spread his hands. After all, there were no grounds for refusal. He nodded his head and made appropriate notes in the file. He turned to Michael. "Let's do it this way. I'll take you home by car now. I'll get you in. We'll make sure everything's all right. You understand, Camille had custody of the girl as a neighbor, and she was already counting on getting this room. Don't worry, comrade investigator. I'll keep the room. Let her live and be happy. She has children of her own, and I don't need it. The only thing is, I ask you to let me sleep there a couple of nights. You know, I'll get everything in order. And then I'll go home. All right. Then let's go. The explorer put on his cap and waved his hand at Michael, saying, "Come with me." Half an hour later, Michael and Molly sat on the bed and heard Camille shouting indignantly. The woman, of course, was not too pleased that a stranger had thrown her out of the room with his presence and taken the girl away. And these are some kind of government benefits. And ration cards. Yes, how can you give him a child? Look at his face. Siberian. He's more like a convict on the run. Do you realize what kind of hands you're putting your child in? Aunt Camille, didn't you say you'd put me in an orphanage? How will you get this room? Everyone in the room fell silent. No one expected that a little girl who had experienced grief would just like that and say in the eyes of adult aunts something that not every man or grown woman can say. What do you know, you little brat? Do you know how much everything costs at the store? Do you know how much it costs to dress you? You didn't want Grandma and Mommy's room. You wanted the jewelry of our noble family. Tears spurted from the girl's eyes. She said all this in 1 minute because the very mystery of family treasures tormented her. And the grief she had experienced, the death of her mother, her grandmother, whose body she had lived with for almost a month. Camille's words about the orphanage did not have the best effect on the little girl's psyche. Little Molly sat and sobbed. She was trembling, and after a few minutes she simply fainted. Go. Call an ambulance. There's a phone booth behind the house. He gave the order loud and clear. The investigator realized how critical the situation could be. A few minutes later, neighbors and medics were already bustling around the house, carrying the baby in their arms and putting her in the ambulance. And Michael himself was not happy that he had stopped here, having started a quarrel with his neighbor. To hell with them, with the treasure, which in principle may not exist. Yes, the fairy tales of Irina's grandmother. Michael said quietly, sitting in the ambulance and holding the baby in his arms. They were taken to the first city hospital, which was the closest. After examining the child, the old doctor stated that she was emaciated. You understand, the girl's exhaustion is total moral and physical. No wonder your fellow policeman told me her story in brief, so I suggest you keep her here for a few days. We'll keep an eye on her, feed her, you bet. We'll examine her, and then we'll see. Thank you, doctor. But I'm not a colleague of the investigator. I'm just the girl's father. But in some ways we're similar. He's a policeman, I'm a scout. So in a way we are colleagues, and we work in different directions. Michael smiled. He was pleased with this doctor. It was obvious that the man was a professional in his place, so he could safely leave the girl here and go home, rest and eat. At the mention of food, Michael's stomach sounded treacherous, but he realized that now he would have to try to arrange his life for himself and his daughter. Are you hungry? The doctor asked and looked carefully at Michael and Molly. The girl looked carefully at her father, then at the doctor and nodded. She could hear her father's stomach churning and understood him perfectly. After all, she knew what hunger and cold were like. Loneliness. Even at her age as a little girl, Molly already understood what some adults didn't. She looked at the doctor and quietly asked if Daddy could eat with us. He's so hungry. And everyone laughed. Of course we can. Honey, come on, Michael. We're having porridge and meat today. I don't think you've had it in a long time. Already at home in Evelyn's room. Michael looked around carefully, set the duffel bag on the floor by the door. Front line have it. Yes, Evelyn, you left me a daughter and a lot of mysteries. I wonder if what Molly said is true, if there is treasure bricked up in the wall of this stove. He looked at the wall of the stove and figured out where the cache might be buried. Michael began to methodically and almost centimeter by centimeter simply knotting the masonry. The sounds were muffled, indicating that the masonry was intact and there was no void inside. The man was almost desperate to find what Molly was talking about. He waved his hand. But his military training did not give him the right to retreat. "Okay, only a couple of turns left to go himself," Michael said, and set up a stool to reach the very ceiling. And indeed, the very masonry of the kiln brick walls went almost to the ceiling. Almost reaching the outermost corner, Michael knocked a couple of times on one brick and immediately heard the familiar muffled sound of a void in the masonry. Cannot be. Could there really be treasure here? But here was a strange sighting of a squirrel, untouched, but scurried around a few times. Has this treasure been untouched for years? Michael stood on the stool and wondered what he should do. Should he break the masonry now and open the hiding place? But if there is nothing there, at least he will check this version and Molly's words about the hidden treasure in the wall stove, and will be able to quietly leave this room, filled with death, the city itself, and go to his homeland. So we should take a wooden hammer, swing it 3 pizzas, and all proceed to dismantle the masonry. But that's tomorrow. Michael carefully got off the stool and put it back in its place. He took a quick bite of something he bought on the way to the market and went to bed. He lay on the bed and thought about Evelyn sleeping here, or maybe her mother Vanessa could often sleep under Molly's side. How homey and warm and cozy was this? I guess that's how it should be in every family, where everyone loves and cares for each other. Tonight, Michael, strangely enough, dreamt of Evelyn. She was standing on the hillside and looking at him. The man smiled and tried to get closer to her. But as he approached, the figure of the once beloved woman melted and vanished into thin air like a ghost. He woke up almost at 5 o'clock, all in tears, not realizing himself why he was sobbing like a child. "Evelyn, how much do I miss you in this life?" Wiping tears with the sleeve of his shirt, Michael lowered his feet off the bed and tried to fumble for the slippers he found in the house yesterday. Strange. He remembered them standing right there in front of the bed. And now, after looking at them, Michael intuitively sensed something wrong. Yep, here are the slippers. But for some strange reason, they were in their usual place by the door. That's odd. Maybe I went barefoot and simply did not remember it. The man rubbed his eyes with his hands and waved his head, chasing the dream away. But if he had been barefoot, he would have remembered it, because the times when he drank ungodly were long gone. So he couldn't write it all off to vodka. Yesterday he hadn't even had a drop in his mouth. All right, the man thought to himself, and slipped his feet into his slippers as he walked barefoot to the threshold. Time for breakfast and run to the hospital to Molly. On the way, stop by the market and buy some milk. Later, an hour later, Michael, with a bag of apples and a liter bottle of milk, stood outside the hospital. The man looked up to the second floor where his daughter's room was, and oh happiness. The little girl was sitting on the windowsill, looking out for him, probably since the morning. "Hi, sweetie. I'll be right up to see you." Michael waved to the girl. "Hi. I've been waiting for you all morning." A few minutes later, Michael entered the room and hugged his daughter, breathing in her baby scent. I'm glad he has her. It's so good that he came here and found his daughter. Now he has a family, and he's not alone. You've been fed. Daughter, they gave us delicious pancakes. That's good. I brought you some apples and milk. You should drink milk. It's calcium. So let's have it while it's warm. Michael took out a bottle and poured thick and still warm milk into his daughter's cup, which the girl drank with pleasure in a minute. She set her cup down for him, and with a smile on her face asked her daddy, "Can I still need a girl? Mine needs one." And Michael gladly poured another portion into his daughter's glass, watching her drink with appetite. He watched and realized that he would do anything for his daughter. He realized that for his daughter's sake, he would sell his soul to make sure Molly grew up well off and never denied herself anything. He looked at her and stroked her head, delighted with her smile, the sparkle in her eyes, and the fact that at least now he could make up for lost time. "Thank you. It's popular to have such delicious milk. All right, Molly, you go ahead and get some rest. Build up your strength. Don't worry. And I'll go to all the authorities and get the paperwork done." Your daughter looked at Michael and grabbed his hand. afraid that he would leave and never come back. "Don't worry, my daughter is back and we will be together. You'll never go to the orphanage. Do you remember?" The girl wanted to remind her father about the treasure in the wall, but was afraid that she might be heard. But the father realized what was bothering his daughter and cautioned. He also put his finger to his lips. "I remember everything. You don't have to worry, sweetheart. Today I will go to social services and passport office, and in the evening I will stop by and bring you ice cream. Do you like ice cream?" Her daughter nodded happily and pulled her arms toward her father. Michael happily picked her up and kissed her and returned her to the bed. He had to go through the instances first and then sort out the personal clutch. Little wonder how much time he and his daughter had left. What if they could leave as early as tomorrow? And the neighbor Camille and her attention to square meters did not give rest. By lunchtime, Michael had already bypassed all the authorities and quickly formalized all the documents for his daughter. And in this helped not only his combat experience and the grip of a scout, but also tears and promises of promises. You can't do much to get your child back. Yeah, Michael thought. He'd never felt such happiness before. "Good afternoon, Michael. How's Molly?" Camille's voice, suddenly coming from around the corner, brought the man back to earth. "Well, if you're interested in her condition, and not in square meters, I can show you what room she's in. It's of interest to you. You took such good care of her." The woman pressed her lips together and said nothing, rapidly pushed into the entryway, tapping her heels on the wooden floor. "Yeah, you can't say anything. I'm surprised the kids didn't take after their mother. They seem like nice kids. All right, I'll just wish her luck in her quest and valiant endeavors." "Totally." Sama meekly walked into the entryway and went to her room. He had to sort out his documents, cook something tasty for his daughter, and visit her in the hospital. And in the evening, the man stood in the kitchen at the stove and thought how to quietly and discreetly dismantle the walls. After all, if you start banging in the evening, it will certainly attract the attention of neighbors. And if you do it right now, knock on the table first as if repairing it. And then already, "Michael, good afternoon. You can't help me." Klitschko's voice called him out of his thoughts. "Yes, Jenna, anything I can do to help." Jenna was a local Mali theater prima donna, performing at street concerts with numbers, singing, sometimes showing tricks. Michael looked at her and understood that Jenna was a person from the category of theatrical bohemia, and such concepts as hammering a nail into a wall or fixing a Primus something incredible. "Michael, you realize I have a wobbly chair and I need to fix it. You can help me." "No problem." "Jenna, I can fix it. I'll just get my lunch ready and then I'll get started. Do you mind?" The girl smiled sweetly and, looking at Michael, asked quietly how Molly was doing. "If necessary, I can get medicine, groceries. You do not think anything bad. My fans are more than willing to help." "Thank you, Jenna." "Nothing yet, but I'll keep that in mind. I'll definitely come to your place sometime." She nodded and went to her room with light steps. It's not weighty. Within 15 minutes, there was already a cooked lunch on the table in the room. And in front of him was the very chair that should have been repaired. Inspecting the unpretentious piece of furniture, the man realized that simply rocked the nuts, which were terminated legs to the seat, but it was necessary to create the appearance of work and noise. So he frantically began to bang on the table. You can't think of anything for fun. It's a lot of fun, though. Maybe there really are jewels hidden in there. It will help him not only to help his daughter, but also to build the log cabin he's been dreaming of for a long time. Then he'll buy some animals and give his daughter enough milk to drink. So we've made a little noise. Now we can start the new wall. The man carefully took a stool and put it under the wall. Started just knotting the upper rows of masonry. Here it is the place where the wooden hammer wrapped around and into the rag. Made a thud. That's where the flower, scarlet, and Michael began to break the wall with clear blows, trying not to make noise. The brick was already old. Time is not sparing anyone, and it was not taken from this masonry. so it gave in easily. In the resulting hole, the man carefully squeezed his hand, and inside the niche felt the end. Yes, you can't pull out such a thing, but maybe it will be possible to open it and just pull out all the stuffing from there. Fumbling for the lock, which was surprisingly simple for a slit, Michael pressed it, and the mechanism easily threw the lid off. It couldn't be that simple, but immediately the man put his hand inside the chest and felt the cold metal. Well, there you have it, noble jewelry. Now Molly and I are going to make a life. And he stretched out a handful of chains and rings of clones. It all glittered with yellow metal and blinded the eyes with bright shimmers of precious stones. It was mesmerizing. Sure, he'd heard of all sorts of enchanted treasures, jewels enriched with blood, but this was really mesmerizing. Michael, you're all right. A knock on the door and a ringing voice brought him out of his stupor. Yes, Jenna, I'm sorry. I can't get it open. Hands in the grease greasing the screws on your desk so it won't snap. Oh, thank you. But I'll come back later. Come on in. An hour later, the man stood like a statue on a stool and listened to the steps of the theater prima donna, praying to himself that someone else did not come and knocked on his door. But there came the long-awaited silence in the hallway. Michael carefully got off the chair, quickly found a small bag, and poured jewelry into it. Nothing now, the rest of the gold here. And bricked up the wall quickly. Nothing for the neighbors to ask stupid questions later. Why the wall is broken in this place and all that. Michael quickly climbed on a stool and put his hand inside the chest again and started to pull out the rest of the treasure. There would be money to put his house on. The last thing Michael fumbled for. There was a large diamond that shone with the purest countenance in the sunlight. Just like a diamond from a royal crown, you can't show it to anyone. Let Emily grow up and decide what to do with it. Michael quickly hid the diamond in a bag, where already called knotted gold jewelry, got off the stool, and began to think where to hide it. But, as luck would have it, nothing came to mind, and time was running out. It was necessary not only to keep the treasure safely, but also to fix the hole in the wall. Aha! I guess I'll just hide the treasure in Molly's toy bear for now. I'll hide it later. Now we need to fix the wall and give this actress her chair. Quickly completing the task, Michael was just about to pick up the repaired table, just as there was another knock on the door. Michael, it's Jenna. I'm at my desk. The man opened the door with a smile on his face and placed a piece of furniture in front of her. You're in, my queen. Please test your chair to make sure it's sturdy and creak-free. And he theatrically invited the woman to sit down. She eagerly responded and sat down on the chair. Michael, giving the master chair, not only does not squeak, but stands firmly on his feet. How can I ever thank you? Jenna rolled her eyes theatrically and looked languidly at Michael. She realized at once that this man was not only handsome, but also with golden hands. And now in such a difficult time to find a good man in the house is difficult. And the fact that he has a child in his arms, so nothing. It's a good thing. You won't have to get pregnant and spoil your figure. I've got it all. I'll have chicken broth for tomorrow, please. I got some homemade chicken for the occasion. I can share half of it with you. Oh, Michael, you're not only responsible, but you're also responsible. That's fine. But then you'll have to come over for lunch, because I'll need to get some broth for Molly as well as myself. How's the poor girl? She's fine. She's not poor. I'm almost done with the paperwork. And then the man bit his tongue. What's he talking about? The old fool. God forbid. Now there will be unnecessary questions about what and how. He quickly said goodbye to Jenna and just put her out with a chair in the hallway, apologizing like a first grader. Jenna, excuse me, I have to change and go to my daughter's hospital. Having closed the door on a lock, the man quickly looked around the room, threw a glance at the masonry plastered in the wall, and thought that it was worth it, probably, to break the whole wall to make this place stand out, quickly prepare the solution. Michael whitened the stove and opened the windows, let ventilate the eggs, and only at that moment he saw Camille watching his windows. Camille, good afternoon. Would you like to come with me to see Molly at the hospital? I'm just about to go. The woman felt a twinge at the words. She'd heard Jenna come to see Michael, asking him to fix a chair, banging on a hammer, and then flirting with that theatrical puppet. Is her room being claimed by this Fifa? No. But when Michael defeated the sad wall and opened the window to see her watching him, Camille was frightened. She's going to get suspicious if she doesn't want to get out of the room. And she had every right to. Next time, I'm in a hurry. I'll bring you guys a delivery for Molly tonight, and I'll do some recon. What did you do in the room? Is everything in place? Sure, come and have tea on the floor and we'll talk. Tea for you. What about wasting sugar on her? I will. You didn't even give the little girl a handful of candy yourself. And everyone's looking. Everybody's looking for something. Maybe she knows about the treasure too. Then I can see why she's holding on to that square footage. Probably guesses that Vanessa might have kept jewelry in the room. But I'm ahead of you, Nadia. You don't want to get your hands on other people's stuff, especially if it's Molly's legal money. I'll use it to put my daughter back on her feet. After closing the door, Michael went to the hospital. The girl must have been waiting for her sister. She's probably sitting on the windowsill like this morning. You shouldn't keep a child waiting. Besides, he had every reason to make the little girl happy. The papers would be ready in a couple of days, and they could leave this terrible place. Michael, as he expected, saw Molly sitting on the windowsill. When she saw her father, there was no limit to her joy. And no wonder. With the death of her mother and grandmother, she had practically lost Camille. Not just to stay here in this house, but to have a family and people close to her. Now she had found a father. Michael was like she often drew him in her dreams, a brawny military man with the same hair, color, with white ride like her gray eyes and strong hugs. The girl did not even doubt for a moment that Michael was her father. She recognized in him by an inner instinct the kindred man who had come to take her to Siberia. She knew that it was cold there, that the land itself was harsh and not always welcoming to newcomers. But the girl gave herself a vow to conquer these harsh expanses. Just like now, she sat on the windowsill and dreamed while waiting for her father. I want to be a researcher, or maybe I'll be an animal doctor or a military officer like my father. She closed her eyes and mentally imagined how she and Michael would live in their new house, where she would have her own separate room, her own bed, table, and textbooks. Here in this corner she would put the floors of books, and here the table on the windowsill would surely be a red geranium. It was pleasant for her to think. To dream like this, and wait for her father. And here he would be. Molly waved her arms, and almost fell off the windowsill. She was scared, but at the same minute she remembered that her father was beside her. He would always pick her up on his arm, even if she fell from the second floor. Molly, please be careful. Michael's heart clenched when the girl almost fell out of the window. He probably wouldn't have survived such a tragedy. No, he knew for sure he'd pick her up. But Daddy, I've waited so long for you. I'm here. Don't worry. I brought you dinner and Lopo's ice cream before it melts. How are you feeling? Good, Dad. That makes my little boy happy. Now listen to me carefully. I'm almost done with all the paperwork. Your birth certificate, where I'll be registered as your father. It's almost done. I'll pick it up one of these days. And there's one more thing. The man looked around carefully, afraid that he was being overheard, but he was alone in the room with his daughter. He got up and opened the door and looked around the corridor. Daughter, don't worry. I found what you told me about. Treasure Molly almost jumped up on the bed, but Michael managed to pick her up in time and cover her mouth with the palm of his hand. Don't scream or they might hear us, the man said. I'm sorry, so there really was treasure in there. Grandma wasn't lying. And you're doubting your grandmother's word. Michael smiled and stroked her head. No, not at all. The girl shook her head cheerfully. And only at that moment she realized that her life had changed dramatically. Daddy, when we go to your place, I'll have a new school. Friends, of course you'll have a new school, friends, and a new home. You want to live with me, don't you? Michael looked carefully at this lovely creature who had changed his life so suddenly. Very much. A week later, Michael and Molly packed their belongings into 2 small suitcases and quietly left the room in the early morning. Michael scrutinized his temporary shelter once again, and for some reason, for the first time in his life, he crossed himself on the threshold. That was it. Now he could leave here and never come to this town again. He carefully, so as not to wake the neighbors, closed the door, locked the lock with 2 turns of the key, and put it under the mat. This was what he had promised his neighbor Camille, with whom it had been agreed that the room would remain hers. The latter, of course, was delighted. But even more, she rubbed Camille's nose in the fact that she would be able to find hidden treasures in it. But that was it. Molly, we're leaving. Maybe you should have said goodbye to your friends and told them everything. No, I'm an adult and I've made my decision. I'm gonna write to my old friends and tell them how I'm living with you in my new home, and they can come visit us later. Of course they can. Come on, let's go back, and my Yaga is in. That's just what my grandmother used to call me. And Molly stopped and cried. For once, the child gave vent to her feelings that she had hidden inside for so long. What can I say? I mean, even a grown man couldn't handle it, and this is a little kid. My daughter, don't cry. Maybe we should stay here after all. Have you thought it over? Yes, I already told you. Let's leave. And she took her father's hand and led him firmly into the street. Just like her mother, Michael thought. So sure, so firm in her actions. A copy of Evelyn. That's why he loved her mother. And now he couldn't get enough of his favorite child. But if the first step had been taken, it was worth going all the way. And Michael went to the sunlight for his little commander, as he later called her. What to say next? This is a different story, which has its own continuation. Very happy. And every participant in the story got his well-deserved reward. Camille got her desired room, but she never found the treasure, though she almost tore up the floors. True, she was able to successfully marry her sons and years later to nurse small grandchildren, in whom he did not dote. Michael, as he wanted, was able to successfully sell some of the jewelry, and for quite a lot of money to build a house and get a job in his native Siberian village Forester. He loved these places, although many people said that it was a harsh land. But only here are born real heroes. He loved his work and his daughter, whom his relatives accepted with great joy. What can I say? The girl was just like her father, and appearance and character. Molly grew up and became a beautiful girl. Entered after school, which she graduated with honors in medical school on pediatrician. She dreamed of taking care of all the children of the planet, so that none of them could not experience what she experienced. She still often dreamed about her. Vanessa, who waited on the threshold of her room and sometimes waved at her. Her mother often came in her dreams and stroked her head. From such dreams, Molly woke up all in tears, but realized her mouth would always be with her in her legacy and future. Daddy, when I was little, my grandmother used to tell me that our treasures were proof of nobility. Maybe I should apply to the Nobility Society and get the status quo. Molly, you're all grown up and still going from Cinderella to princess. Dad, I'm gonna argue with you on this one. This is what my grandmother Vanessa wanted. So I'm gonna file the paperwork and include a picture of that necklace we have on it. By the way, glue, macaroni. This I read in an encyclopedia, the mark of a master jeweler who served at the court of the Empress. Yes, who, by the way, was shot by the revolutionaries. Daughter, maybe we should let it lie until better times, right? Emily didn't know what to do. She wanted to do her grandmother's will, but on the other hand, she realized that her father was right. Times are hard right now. Maybe we should just wait it out. Here you know that daughter Michael lived a piece of cutlet, which Molly cooked and continued. Graduated from college. You'll be almost 21. And then you can do whatever you want. Okay. The girl ate and thought, and realized how right her father was. Maybe it was really worth waiting until she graduated from the institute, and then time would tell. She smiled, And looking playfully at her father, suggested Paul. Let's go to the place where I grew up as a little girl. Molly, do you really want to do that? Michael almost choked on his fries. Daddy, I've been dreaming about Mom again. I really want to visit her and Grandma Vanessa's grave. You have no idea, do you? The man put his fork and knife on the table and put his head in our clenched fists. He thought about it. He had long ago made a vow not to remember the place from where he took his little girl, but to visit the graves. Okay, I don't mind just getting through the session. And by the way, I'm taking a vacation in July. We can go there, and then we can go to the sea. Let's do it the other way around. Michael did not understand, looked at his daughter, asking a mute question. How? First we'll go to the sea, and then to the grave of Mom and Grandma. Do you understand? Not Mom, not Grandma, have never been to the sea. And from there I want to bring them seashells and put them on their graves, so they can hear the sound of the sea in the next world. And then Molly couldn't take it anymore. She dreamt of her grandmother again, but now she was walking towards her, asking for directions with her mother, and they waved at her. How she wanted to run up to her grandmother's dress, like she did when she was a child, to hug her with her warm arms and stroke her head. Daughter, but don't cry. The man himself couldn't bear his daughter's tears, and at the mention of Evelyn as well, he soured. He stood up and paced around the kitchen, not knowing how to calm Molly and calm himself. Okay, let's do it this way. I agree. Just don't cry. I won't. I'm sorry. It just came on. Molly went to the bathroom where she was face again with cool water and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Here again eyes will be red until the evening, and she still have to go out with Tulloch to dance. The girl fixed her hair in a braided braid and tried to smile to herself. How did she become like her mother? Molly thought, remembering the only picture of Evelyn. But I'm my mother's daughter. She went into the kitchen, where Michael stood by the open window, smoking. On the table was an empty shot glass and a cob, a bottle of cognac. Dad, what were you drinking? Michael himself did not like this business, but now he was so eager to drink just a shot, so to speak, and to memorialize the admirers, that while his daughter was in the bathroom, he could not resist, took out a sealed bottle of cognac from the refrigerator and poured himself a shot. Yes, sorry, I just couldn't help but remember our dead. Did you say the right thing about the sea? We'll bring them presents. Let them be happy for you and me. Everything will be fine with you. The train rushed and brought in a compartment of father and daughter who were happy and tanned from the sea. Lucky, thought many people, and they were right. But the faces of Michael and Molly did not shine with joy. Each of them was thinking about their hometown and the days of death they had spent there. Molly, let me go and get you some tea with lemon. Yes, with lemon. Her father's voice brought the girl out of her stupor. She loved him very much and realized that he was having a hard time as well. Once she even stammered to him that maybe you father should marry a second time. You're still young. You're still handsome. But at that moment, Michael looked at her so much that Molly was silent for a long time. Look over there. And the man pointed with his finger to the hold on which Evelyn's picture stood in a beautiful frame. She was, and is, and always will be the mistress of this place. No woman can replace her. You don't count. And turning around, Michael quickly put on his jacket and shoes. He went outside. It was autumn, but he did not notice the passing rain, not the cold dampness that took to the bones. The man walked around town for a beat to o'clock, remembering Evelyn, but on the other hand realizing that Molly wanted to do him good. Returning home, he shouted Molly from the doorstep. You're home? Yes, Daddy. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you, did I? It's just that you love me and you want the best for me. Michael sat down on a chair in the hallway and began to take off his shoes. He quietly said to Evelyn's daughters over there, and he pointed his finger upstairs, and you are here, you are my whole family and my happiness. Got it? And don't say that to me again. Put some tea on. That's how they lived. And now, standing by the graves of Evelyn and Vanessa, they were each thinking about something different. But now there was no sadness on their faces, only love. Mom, Grandma, I brought you seashells and your favorite flowers, cornflowers, and for you, Mom, and for you, Grandma, peonies. Good afternoon, Evelyn, and good afternoon to you, Grandma Vanessa, and look at your granddaughter, beautiful future doctor. I didn't abandon her, as many people thought, but raised her to be a beauty. A tear traitorously rolled down to my eyes. The man tried to hold back, but could not. He put candy and cookies on the graves and walked away, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Michael has become sentimental. Don't cry. Look over there, my daughter pointed to the sky. There's a pair of white swans surrounding it. That's our grandma and mom, really, Dad. It can't be otherwise. Let's go to the hotel. It's getting dark. We have an early train tomorrow. Come on, Dad. Father and daughter walked along the country road. They were happy, the two of them, and each realized that better things were ahead. That night, Molly dreamed of her mother and grandmother for the last time. They were standing on a hillock and waving to the girls, and Molly ran toward them with all her legs. She saw herself as a little girl for some reason. Molly, wake up, daughter. You're dreaming and having a nightmare again. Her father held her by the shoulder, waking up to her screaming. We should take her to the doctor. Dad, Mom, and Grandma came to me in my dreams again. They often visit you in your dreams. Did they scare you this time? No. The girl wiped her tears with her hands, took a glass of water from the nightstand, and took a couple of sips. They were saying goodbye to me. Daddy, I won't see them in my dreams anymore. And she burst into tears even harder. Daughter, they will always live in our memory, in our hearts. They sat like that until almost morning. The daughter snuggled into her father's shoulder and howled sobs. And at dawn, Molly got up and went to the window and opened it wide open. Daughter, I hope you don't do anything stupid. I'm fine. I just realized that now I have to say goodbye to them too. I waved to the sun. She waved at the rising sun with both hands. She needed here to let go of her former fears and open like this window of her life to new accomplishments. Now she understood what her mother and grandmother wanted to tell her. Thank you, my family. I will always remember and love you. They drove home, and all the way home, of the girl's face. Yes, she found her peace of mind next to her father in her new home and the town she had loved from the very first day. She looked out the window and imagined driving to her new life. Like when she was a little girl, when her father took her to a small Siberian town. Everything would be fine, the girl thought, and she was right. After all, everything in her life turned out in the best possible way. As her grandmother wanted, Molly became a doctor and the best pediatrician in the city. She successfully married a wonderful man and gave birth to 2 children, a son and a daughter, who was named Evelyn in honor of her mother. But she did not apply to join the noble society, reasoned that maybe it is not worth stirring up the past, and if I want to become a noblewoman, I can always do it. And now she met her husband from work and set a delicious dinner on the table. Why stir up the past? Let it be there behind the threshold, and here will always be warm and cozy.